All right. After some silliness on my part, I went live and didn't realize my audio inputs were completely turned off. So I was silent the entire time and didn't realize it. So we're just restarting the stream. Um, we're jumping into researching the book of Genesis, and I've seen this video before, and I figured this is a fine spot to begin our research on what this person's take on who wrote the Bible. And I remember feeling or respecting their findings and their presentation. So I'm gonna watch it again. It's been a couple years since I've seen it. This video came out like 4 years ago. All right, Cheryl. All right. All right, audio seems to be working, so let's go with it.
Bible into the Old Testament and New Testament. Well, what Christians call the Old Testament is actually the exact same book as what we Jews simply know as the Jewish Bible or the Tanakh. What about the Torah then? Well,
Let's see. All right, sounds like the audio is working pretty well, so that's good on both fronts.
Christians call the first 5 books of the Old Testament the Pentateuch, meaning the 5 scrolls. These are Genesis through Deuteronomy. For Jews, these same 5 books are called the Torah. So the Torah is simply the name for the first 5 books of the Tanakh, which happen to be the exact same 5 books as the first 5 books of the Christian Old Testament. So it doesn't matter if you pick up a Jewish Bible or a Christian Bible. Other than some minor translation differences, the first 5 books are going to be exactly the same. Now, there's a third Jewish book you might have heard of that also starts with a T. That's the Talmud. But the Talmud is not actually considered part of the Jewish Bible. It's an entirely different book, comprised of oral traditions and commentary on those traditions written by rabbis. What we're going to be concerned with in this episode is just the Torah, or Pentateuch, aka Genesis through Deuteronomy. So let's dive in. From a traditional point of view, the answer to the question, who wrote this part of the Bible, is easy. It was Moses. And for some Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians, there is simply no questioning that. But for the majority of Jews today, like myself, as well as most Christians, the answer is not so simple. As I mentioned in my video on Did Moses Exist? From a historian's point of view, Moses is more of a legendary character. And
So I've not gotten to Moses in my readings. I have only read Genesis so far, so maybe we'll come back and watch his video on this as well when I'm guessing Exodus would be probably that'll be when we get into Moses. So interesting that his findings have concluded that Moses is a legendary character. I mean, he is quite legendary, but let's keep going.
And the stories about him quite clearly include many literary elements. It's also very obvious to language experts who study the Torah that it is definitely not the work of a single author. Rather,
all right. Or potentially just, well, let's keep going. Let's keep going.
It clearly consists of many layers that were pieced together over time. Now, this actually makes a lot of sense, considering that the Torah deals with events that were initially passed down orally. Whenever this happens, you usually wind up with multiple versions of the same story, and this is exactly what you find in the Torah. For example, there are two separate creation accounts, two separate stories of Abraham lying about his wife Sarah, two accounts of God changing Jacob's name to Israel, and so on. According to some tallies, there are about 30 examples of these kind of doublets in
30 doublets. Interesting.
the Torah. So what almost every scholar agrees on within the field of Pentateuch studies is that there were definitely several distinct authors involved. But what they do not agree on is exactly who those authors were and in which order they contributed their material. Because of this, I cannot present you with one definitive answer to who wrote the Torah and when. Therefore, I'm going to present you with 3 different theories and let you make the final decision. The first theory is the one that you're most likely to have heard of if you're at all familiar with any of this. It's called the documentary hypothesis, and it's been around since the...
All right. First theory, documentary hypothesis.
...1800s. Nowadays, there are many variations of it, but the basic idea is that the Torah was pieced together from 4 different original sources. These have been labeled
Pieced together by 4 different original sources.
the Yahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomist, and priestly sources.
Interesting. Okay.
Or more commonly, J, E, D, and P. Note that I'll be using these 4 letters extensively throughout the rest of the video. So, according to the documentary hypothesis, Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers are all a mix of J, E, and P. Leviticus is entirely P, and as you might have guessed, Deuteronomy is entirely D. Note that the black areas of the chart represent other texts that do not fall into the main 4. The original theory was that J was written during the reign of Solomon, when the Israelites were supposedly united and at the height of their power. E was written by someone in the breakaway northern kingdom of Israel. D was written during the reign of Josiah, after the fall of the northern kingdom, and P was written after the Jews returned from Babylon. Now, like I said, there are many different variations of this theory. For example, nowadays, J and E are often combined into a single source. P is sometimes placed before the exile, and D is usually divided into 2 or more stages. But the basic theory remains the same. Multiple sources combined together to create the Torah, sometime during the Second Temple period. However, the main problem with this theory is the overall timing. The latest research from archaeology indicates that the Bible greatly exaggerates its description of Solomon's reign. In fact, many scholars today believe that there likely never was a unified kingdom, and that the Israelites were probably not strict monotheists until the reign of King Josiah. Which brings me to the second theory, the supplementary hypothesis. The supplementary hypothesis.
All right.
Is kind of an updated or modified version of the documentary hypothesis. It's probably the most popular view nowadays, although keep in mind that there are also several different versions of it. According to this theory, Deuteronomy, or D, was the original version of the Torah, and it was indeed written around the time of King Josiah. Some scholars believe that this is when monotheism really started to be promoted in a big way for the first time. The reason being that it was a way to unify the newcomers from the north with the original inhabitants from the south. But in a major change from the original theory, J and E are no longer seen as separate sources, but rather as supplementary material that was added alongside D during the Babylonian exile. And P is seen as an additional set of supplementary material added by priests during the Second Temple period. Finally, scholars now talk about a final author called R for redactor, who added just a few more things here and there before the Torah was finally complete. So rather than 4 separate sources, instead we get a single source with additional material being added to it over time. So that's basically where 21st century biblical scholarship currently stands on the matter. However, there is a new theory being explored nowadays, mostly in continental Europe. It came to my attention through a book called Genesis and the Moses Story, originally written in German by Konrad Schmid. I'm going to label this theory the dual origins theory. The main idea is that the
dual origins, the duel of fates.
The ancient Israelites originally had 2 separate origin myths, one involving the 3 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the other involving Moses and the Exodus story. According to this new theory, the These 2 literary traditions developed independently from each other and remained separate until they were combined for the first time by the priestly writer. So D, which is obviously based on the Moses tradition, was written down first during the time of King Josiah. But at the same time as D, as well as both before and after D, there were other fragments of text floating around, some of which were based on the Moses tradition, but others of which were based on the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob tradition. Then, sometime during the Second Temple period, a group of priests living in Jerusalem decided, for the first time ever, to combine the 2 literary traditions into a single coherent narrative. They took bits from both the patriarchs' story and bits from the Moses story. These are the sections that were previously labeled J and E, and then they interwove them with their own text, the parts labeled P. Finally, someone at an even later stage, the redactor, or R, added a few final things, tacked Deuteronomy onto the end, and voila, the final version of the Torah was born. This third theory makes a lot of sense to me. It explains why the transition between Genesis and Exodus seems so abrupt, and why there are several chronological problems when it comes to dating how long the Israelites were in Egypt. In my view, everything prior to the divided monarchy falls into the category of myth and legend anyway, and therefore I see no problem with the idea of two separate sets of legends developing instead of just one. In fact, considering that the ancient Israelites were originally two separate kingdoms, it actually makes more sense that there would be two separate origin stories, not just one. So what biblical scholars are slowly starting to realize is that when it comes to the history of ancient Israel, we've basically had it backwards. Up until recently, the idea was that Israel was a united nation first and then a divided nation second, because that's what a literal reading.
We're getting a little ahead of the text for my purposes here, but some of this I can definitely use for my video as well. But yeah, we're definitely getting ahead of the text. So I'll take some of this with a grain of salt. Might come back for this once we're done with like Exodus, and or some of this might still apply to Exodus. It seems like when we get to them coming out of Egypt and forming Judah and Israel and what have you, then this will be more relevant.
Of the Bible tells us. But as we continue to learn more from archaeology and literary analysis, we're discovering that the exact opposite was actually true. The Israelites were originally two separate nations, and then only later, after Assyria destroyed the north, did they become a truly unified people. Remember, after the north fell, many refugees from the Kingdom of Israel headed south and joined the Kingdom of Judah. So the unification happened not during the days of David and Solomon, but during the days of Hezekiah and Josiah, and then again after the Babylonian exile.
One thing I want to be sure of is not to just take this video face value. You know what I mean? This is just one person's research. This is interesting. When we get to this part in my own reading of the Bible, then I'll go, wait, I'm not going to waste my time on this. It'd be a waste of time now. I will spend the time later when we're at this point in the Bible, because this does seem like is interesting, yeah.
Now, here's the part that I haven't heard anyone say yet. So keep in mind that this is pure conjecture at this point. In my opinion, I think it's more likely that the Moses tradition was the origin story developed in the northern kingdom, and the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob tradition was the origin story developed in the southern kingdom. For a long time now, scholars have associated D with Levite priests from the northern city of Shiloh, even though it was eventually compiled in the south in Jerusalem. As I mentioned in my video about Moses, the tribe of Levi has several interesting connections to Egypt and may have been the only tribe involved in some sort of historical exodus. Overall, it would appear that Moses was more of a northern hero, and Aaron was adopted as more of a southern hero. The southern priests were actually a bit negative toward Levites in general, and were known for believing that only their particular lineage, which they traced to Aaron, was truly legitimate. Joseph, the other main character associated with Egypt, was also more of a northern hero. He was supposedly the progenitor of the two largest northern tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. In contrast, in the south, Judah was portrayed as being the most important son of Jacob. In fact, it's possible that Joseph was originally not thought of as a son of Jacob at all. Note that Jacob has two names, Jacob and Israel. Maybe these were originally two separate people. Maybe Jacob was the father of Judah and Israel was the father of Joseph. Maybe it was only later that Jacob and Israel were merged into a single character. So interestingly, the North has more associations with Egypt, and the South has more associations with Mesopotamia. Remember, Mesopotamia is where Abraham was said to originate from. And it is the book of Genesis that incorporates mythology that is very reminiscent of Mesopotamian mythology, the flood story being a good example. Perhaps this material was picked up during the Babylonian exile. So, as is often the case, history is strongly influenced by geography. Because the Israelites were for so many centuries nestled between two major powers, Egypt on one side and Assyria Babylon on the other, it's not surprising that they developed a culture that fused elements from both these powers and their various interactions with them. Anyway, like I said, this third theory is yet to be fully fleshed out. The second theory is the one that's currently the more mainstream explanation. But I think the dual origins theory is very promising, and therefore I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I think it is likely to be the dominant theory in the future. Okay, so that was a look at who wrote the Torah. Let me know in the comments what your opinion is on the topic, and stay tuned for the next episode in the series.
So I was kind of hoping it would go a bit more in depth there. Granted, it's only a 17-minute video. A nice little overview, a little appetizer, nice little taster there. Like okay, interesting to get some broad overview, but okay. Let's see what else we have here. Yeah, it's one of those things. Pretty sure there's a look. We might be bouncing around a bit here, so. But then again, and it's one of those things where I have a certain idea of how much I want my own video to cover, and sometimes I'm like, right now I'm sort of like, well, where do we want to start? I'm not sure. I should have probably figured that out before the start of the stream, but here we are, so we'll just do it on stream. Not only like what do I want to focus on, but where do I want to go for that information? I mean, the Bible is just such a probably thousands of videos on this topic. Who to, who to look at first and who's worth my time. Even if I Googled it, it's like who do I want to use as a source? That's tough. It's not an easy thing, If I were to find like some academic articles, it's like, well, how much should I trust any given article? Mm. Mm. All right, I'm gonna take a smoke break for a moment. Get a cigarette and just a little quick think on this. All right, be right back. Fortunately, I think we're just going to be bouncing around a bit with this until I kind of, feel like I have a good, well-rounded perspective. So let's just gonna go with what I'm thinking right now. I'm not gonna worry too much about it. Um, pretty sure wasn't there a could have sworn I watched. Yeah, something like this. Um, that's interesting. That might have been what I've seen. Patterns of evidence exodus. And a little ahead maybe. Yeah, we're looking for evidence. You know what I mean? Let's see what this is. What we got here. This might just be
The whole thing, from the beginning of the sojourn in Egypt, the slavery, Moses and the Exodus, the conquest of the Promised Land, is all there in one nice, neat line, but it's way too early.
I don't believe there was a single event that we can call the Exodus.
This person can't have seen all this. He imagined it.
I'm very much against chronological revisionism.
There is nothing else like this in the whole of Egyptian history.
Really?
Nothing at all.
When you put those cities side by side, the biblical account and the archaeology match extremely well.
okay, this is just a trailer. You know, might be worth watching. I think I've seen this before a long time ago. I mean, it came out in 2015. They're using the word validity. Oh, that's one of the words I used in like what trying to validity, accuracy, evidence. Well, I mean, might as well. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves with Exodus, though. That's the only issue. Hmm. Let's see. Put a pin in that. Oh, it is interesting. Tempted. Because I'm pretty sure I remember watching this and it being fairly compelling. So I'm pretty sure they do their due diligence in the matter. Hmm. All right, I need to like. So earlier I kind of wrote down like the 6 sections of Genesis, like section 1, Adam and Eve / creation. Section 2, flood, post-flood. Section 3, Abraham, Abram. Section 4, Isaac. Section 5, Jacob and Israel. Section 6, Joseph. All right. Hmm. All right. Try to. Next thing I want to do is sort of make sections of kind of general ideas I want to hit on with my own video. two of those being like, who is God? How is God portrayed? You know, I think those are two things I kind of want to look at from the perspective of Genesis, but also kind of cross-referencing with my own experience and with what is sort of, I guess you could say, more or less conclusions we've come to today compared to how God is portrayed in Genesis specifically. So that's sort of like, that's one. See, tense of is for Abraham. Yeah. What's this?
There seems to be two different schools of thought when it comes to the historicity of Abraham. The first school of thought argues for the existence of Abraham, stating that the narratives in Genesis fit well within the ancient Near Eastern context in the Second Mill. For example, the execration texts witness an influx of Northwest Semitic peoples into Canaan described as Amoritic. Additionally, proponents of this argument argue that Mari, shown here, and Nuzi texts fill in our understanding of the NBA. The Mari texts, dated to the 18th century, give proper names just like those of the patriarchs. Contrarily, though, scholars like von Saders and Thompson question the parallels of Mari and Nuzi, shown here.
Nuzi texts, which were also written in Akkadian, list customs of living in northern Mesopotamia and BCE. They reflect legal and social practice that may correspond with the Old
Stating
Testament.
that Abraham was a literary figure. Although the proper names fit the Second Mill, they belong better in a later chronological period and have little value in dating any of the patriarchs. Thompson concludes, therefore, that the patriarchal accounts fit much better in later compositional periods, targeted at an Iron Age audience rather than the historical period of the Middle Bronze Age society.
Three of the world's major religions trace back to one man, who the Bible says was named Abraham. However, skeptics allege there is not enough evidence to suggest this man ever existed, or even if he did exist. The stories about him in Genesis are probably later embellished legends. Does the account of Abraham correlate to a real time in history, or is the account of him just another later
A real time in history. It's an interesting wording.
fabrication? If you add up the dates in the Bible, Abraham would have existed in the early Bronze Age.
Okay. I did write down somewhere in my notes I wanted to get like an, I guess timeline is something I would like to have. All right. Okay.
Sometimes also referred to as the Intermediate Bronze Age. However, Craig Olson notes there are numerous difficulties with placing Abraham back this far, because several things Genesis records would contradict what the archaeological record says about this time period. However, as we noted in our video on Genesis 5, Abraham and the ages of his immediate descendants seem to be idealized formulas.
Idealized formulas. What? 17. Okay. You just pick whatever Can we find numbers that add up to 17 that also multiply into these numbers? Oh, but look, goes 1, 3, 5, 7. Then it goes 5, 6, 7, 8, 5, 6, 7, 8. Look at this. Look at this beautiful math.
Probably do not reflect their actual ages. Olson also notes there are a few indications in Genesis.
Yeah, that would be wild if it actually were their accurate ages. Yeah, that would be insane. Insane. You know, my theory is like maybe they, who knows, maybe they counted age differently or something. Like, maybe it was like every solstice was a year. Like they counted years as like half years or something. I don't know, dude. Even then, if you go further back, it doesn't make much sense. But yeah.
Notes there are a few indications in Genesis that Abraham did not actually live to be 175. Like that he didn't think people past the age of 100 could have children.
Shall a child be born to a man who... Sure.
Which would contradict the idea that Terah fathered him at age 130. Even more damning for this theory is that it is based on the Masoretic reading of Exodus 12:40, which says the people of Israel lived in Egypt for 430 years. In the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Greek Septuagint, it says the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt and Canaan was 430 years. Paul also seems to confirm this in Galatians, when he says that the law of Moses came 430 years after the promise was made to Abraham. If the Exodus happened between 1450 and 1400 BC, which we will cover in an upcoming video, this would actually place Abraham in the Middle Bronze Age. 430 is also probably rounded up for symbolic purposes, meaning Abraham could have even lived in the 18th century BC, and I don't think that would change much. Now, when we look at the evidence for Abraham in the Middle Bronze Age, we find the account of Genesis correlates well with the customs, laws, and archaeological sites from this time period, strengthening the reliability of the account. To begin with, some skeptics assert that the name of Abraham is likely a literary invention, since it means father of many. However, the Hebrew language didn't exist until centuries later, and the names Abram and Abraham might just be Hebraized forms of earlier names. And plus, the names could have helped shape the later language. Furthermore, we have found evidence of the personal name, Abba Rama, from around the 20th century at a city called Dilbat. The name Abu Rahana has been found in execration texts at Saqqara. The same components that make up the name Abram have also been found in Mari, Ebla, Ugarit, and Cyprus. The name Abraham probably is just a Hebraized form of one of these earlier names, and would fit with the cultural world of the Middle Bronze Age. Gosta Ahlstrom says, these occurrences show that the name Abram is authentic and not completely uncommon among West Semites.
Yeah, the existence of Abraham isn't crazy to me. It's everything that occurred with him that feels very somewhat mythical or unusual in certain components. But the idea that, like, it's a dude Abraham, he had Isaac, he had Jacob, Joseph was then like went to Egypt. None of that is all that crazy. None of that is out of the realm of possibility. It's just what the text is recording that happened with these characters that seems a little just sometimes a little odd. So, you know, that's why I take it with a grain of salt. But the idea of somebody, whatever Abraham's name really was, that person existed doesn't seem insane to me.
Also in Mari texts, we have found the name Laban and Ishmael. Terah, Sereg, and Nahor resemble place names in the region of Haran, and Nahor and Haran are also mentioned in the Mari tablets.
Mari tablets. Should write that down. Check that out. I think that's like the second time I've seen that. I think, wasn't just that other little short that we watched mention the Mari text? Mari text.
So there are several examples of names fitting with the time period of the Middle Bronze Age. Now Genesis 11 and 12 says Abraham and his family moved out from the city of Ur, which was in the land of Sumer, and they moved north to Haran, before Abraham made the trip to Canaan. This seems odd because Abraham was supposed to be a nomad, yet is connected to cities. But during the Middle Bronze Age, nomadic herders had family connections to cities and would travel hundreds of miles in all directions.
Well, it's probably easier to, if you connect it to a city, it's easier to explain to people where he was. Not like, I mean, you could say east of Ur, you could, well, he was in Ur. He was in that general region. That's probably where he, like, you know, sold the wool that he had, or maybe if he needed to sell some mutton, you know, he probably was in that vicinity where that's where he conducted his trade. That's my guess, at least.
Richard Hess notes that the archives in Mari reveal the herders and the citizens of the town were part of larger families. These herders also traveled long distances from home and maintained family ties that stretched hundreds of miles and crossed the city-state borders of that early period. Not only is this true of Jacob and his sons in Genesis 37, but it also describes something of Jacob's earlier life, his connections with his father Isaac in southern Palestine, and his relationship to his uncle Laban in Haran, hundreds of miles to the north. This separation of families was common at Mari. In Genesis, Abraham leaves from Ur and then Haran, and then lives as a nomad, whereas Lot settles in Sodom. Jacob sends Joseph out from his home base to search for his brothers, who have wandered somewhere in the vicinity of Shechem. The lifestyle of living nomadically and still being connected to cities or settlements was common in the Middle Bronze Age, as attested in the Mari texts. Daniel Fleming reviewed several of these documents from Mari and says, as a whole, the Genesis picture of ancestral pastoralism is remarkably plausible in light of the Mari evidence.
Yeah.
Another interesting aspect.
Never found, well, maybe I should have found it odd. But to me, it's not that odd. Whether I should or shouldn't have, I don't know. Anyway.
Aspect is Abraham at one point wanders down to Egypt. During the Intermediate Bronze Age, Egypt was experiencing something known as the First Intermediate Period, and the evidence suggests the Egyptians tried to keep travelers from Canaan out. However, things changed completely during the later Middle Kingdom of Egypt. A tomb from around 1870 BC shows 37 Asiatics visiting Egypt. In a work known as the Tale of Senuha, Senuha fled to Canaan when Amenhotep I died, around 1944 BC, where he met a tribal pastoralist who had been in Egypt. Trade routes appear to have been open during the Middle Bronze Age, paving a way for Abraham to make the journey. We also have evidence the pharaohs in the Middle Kingdom and the later New Kingdom were attracted to and sought out foreign women, which makes Pharaoh's attraction to Sarah plausible. The rationale for going to Egypt to escape a famine also seems plausible. Phyllis Soretta notes that centuries earlier, during the Old Kingdom of Egypt, there is a depiction of Asiatics coming to Egypt to escape a famine. It depicts groups of famine-stricken men and women, emaciated and weak. That they are the desert Bedouins seeking food in Egypt during a period of famine is probable.
Famines, famines happened not like, as far as I understand it, like, wasn't uncommon for there to be a famine. A 7-year famine might be something that's a bit uncommon, but famines happen from time to time. So
Abraham would have likely followed the same rationale, given that there was a famine in Canaan during his time. However, the famine of Abraham is only mentioned as a brief incident. After he returns to Canaan, he and his descendants seem to prosper for several years before another famine occurs, indicating the famine he experienced was probably only a minor occurrence. Finkelstein and Langut argue the Middle Bronze Age was more humid than the previous period. But within this time period, there were also 2 points indicating minor droughts, one of which could have been the drought that caused a famine, which would have pushed Abraham into Egypt. Manfred Bietek also notes that during the Middle Kingdom, Egyptian kings had an East Delta residence, which would make more sense in terms of Abraham coming in from the east and meeting with the pharaoh. The pharaoh also used escorts to take Abraham out of the country, and this fits with Egyptian customs. In the tale of Senuha, escorts are sent to bring Senuha back into the country. The reverse of escorting Abraham out of the country seems to fit with the use of escorts for crossing the border of Egypt. So Abraham's trip to Egypt also seems plausible and fits with the cultural context of the world of the Middle Bronze Age. Within Canaan, the existence of cities and towns mentioned in Genesis also seems to fit with this time period. Finkelstein summarizes the situation. Important biblical sites that are mentioned in the Abraham story, such as Shechem, Beersheba, Hebron, did not yield finds from the intermediate Bronze Age. These sites were simply not inhabited at this time. However, Finkelstein also notes the existence of cities mentioned in Genesis are attested to in the Middle Bronze Age. We have found evidence of Laish and Shechem. Bethel, Hebron, and Gerar appear to have been occupied as well. Kathleen Kenyon states that the evidence of occupation at Jerusalem only goes back to around 1800 BC. A plausible location for Aya also dates back to the Middle Bronze Age. There is, however, no evidence of a settlement at Beersheba during this time period, but Genesis only refers to it as a group of wells, not a city or established settlement. Thus, the cities that Genesis mentions fit extremely well with the Middle Bronze Age. In Genesis 14, it mentions a coalition of kings that attacked the cities of the plain, which we refer to as Sodom and Gomorrah. Prior to 2000 BC, the whole region was ruled by the third dynasty of Ur. A coalition of kings from the area would have been impossible if the kings of Ur were still reigning. However, after this, the ancient Near East broke up into smaller kingdoms, and evidence shows that during the Middle Bronze Age, coalitions between various kings were formed. More interestingly, in Genesis 14, it mentions the king of Elam was involved. There was only one time when Elam engaged in the politics of Mesopotamia, which was during the Middle Bronze Age. It is recorded they sent envoys as far west as Katna. The existence of a coalition of kings is quite plausible within this time period, as the various kings fought for total control of the area before Hammurabi finally succeeded. Abraham's nighttime raid is also plausible in this time period. Raids appear to have been a common practice of warfare. Similar to what we see in Genesis, one text from Mari records that 300 Yemenites have gone to raid the encampment on the bank of the Euphrates. Also, the narrative of Genesis 14 fits with the narrative structure of a text called Yucca Dumlim, which dates to around the same time period. Both begin with the first raid or war, and one side being made a vassal, followed by a revolt, and then the vassal being subdued again. Genesis then includes Abraham's victory. Then it's followed by religious ceremonies and tithes. So the account of Genesis 14 fits extremely well with the Middle Bronze Age, just before the reign of Hammurabi. Genesis 15 continues the account and records a covenantal ceremony between Abraham and God, and has correlations to this same time period, instead of it matching the structure of later texts, like what we see in Jeremiah 34.
Also, for my own sake, one thing to remember with all this, and it's fairly easy for me to keep this in mind. In any of these books, like one or even several things that are like, yeah, that's that, here's the proof that that portion is correct, does not make the rest of the text correct. And alternatively, one portion being clearly like that didn't happen, like, is not evidence for the rest of the book to be a fabrication. That's what makes this tricky, but also intriguing at the same time, at least for me.
Richard Hess notes a similar custom was found at the Bronze Age city of Alalak. The texts found there were written in the Old Babylonian script. One of these tablets describes the swearing of an oath and involves a ritual, not unlike that of Genesis 15.
The texts found there were written in the Old Babylonian. One of these tablets described the swearing of an oath that not unlike that of Genesis 15 was this text led to the view that it preserves evidence for a covenant-making ceremony, early 2nd millennium BC, West Semitic culture of Alakar.
Wiseman's publication of this text, AT 456, led to the view that it preserves evidence for a covenant-making ceremony in the early 2nd millennium BC, West Semitic culture of Alalak. Genesis also records that the patriarchs made 4 treaties during their lives, and they have striking similarities to treaties from the same time period that have been found at the sites of Mari and Tel Leilan, and not so much to treaties found in later time periods. The treaties begin with declaring the gods as witnesses, followed by the swearing of an oath, stipulations, a ceremonial act, and then curses.
Curses. It's interesting that
the treaties begin with declaring the gods as witnesses, followed by the swearing of an oath, stipulations,
interesting. Okay. Huh. That is interesting. That's cool.
Ceremonial act, and then curses. Victor Matthews also notes the difficulties faced by Abraham and Isaac in dealing with Abimelech of Gerar provide one of the best comparisons to the administrative text from Mari. Negotiation of water rights and the problems associated with the transient populations are quite clear. In terms of customs, the account of Abraham also fits with the Middle Bronze Age, and not entirely with later Israelite customs found in the Mosaic Law. Most notably is the practice of a ceremony of an heir by proxy. Sarah, Rachel, and Leah provide their handmaidens for their husbands in order to have offspring. Parallels can be found in other texts from the city of Nuzi from about the same time period. They record instances of a wife who was unable to provide a child, so she would offer a slave or a servant to create an heir for her and her husband. Now, some skeptics, like Finkelstein, Thomas Thompson, and Van Cedars, have argued this practice is also found in later times during the Iron Age and doesn't necessarily correlate to the Middle Bronze Age. However, Kenneth Kitchen and Richard Hess.
Well, as long as it's happening during the Middle Bronze Age, that's what's important. It's not about whether it continued to happen into the Iron Age. It's like, okay, but it did happen during the Middle Bronze Age. That seems to be what's important in this situation. If everything's kind of lining up for the Middle Bronze Age, then yeah, it's like, okay, it happened later. Cool.
Note that the skeptics have glossed over notable differences in the examples they pull from later time periods, and they don't parallel to the biblical account, like the texts from Newsy do from the Middle and Late Bronze Age. Hess says, the 12th century BCE Egyptian text that Van Seters finds as a parallel is a list of unusual adoptions, not normal ones. The 7th century BCE Assyrian marriage document says nothing about inheritance. The female slave may be sold off at will. For Thompson, the Newsy parallel does not mention barrenness and is a legal contract, contra Genesis. However, the parallel is a husband having a child by another woman when his wife is unable to bear children. Further, Late Bronze Age Alalak text number 93 exemplifies a condition where barrenness establishes a legal requirement to conceive by another woman. Behind such laws lies the importance attached to families and to inheritance rights.
There's also the potential that, like, you know, what are laws in the, and more like guidelines? How strict were, say, the laws of Mari over or the laws of even Canaan over individual families? If a family agreed amongst themselves to do such a thing and attribute a child as the successor, I don't know how strictly enforced certain laws. It's sort of like when a cop sees you going 70 and a 65, he's like, well, there's leniency in certain things. What I'm saying is, like, just because that's like the written down, this is how things go normally, does not mean that everybody followed it strictly or that it was always enforced strictly, But it's good to know. Only that it's not to like, oh, this law was in place, therefore this couldn't have happened. It's like, that's not how human beings operate. Especially back in the day when again, if they came across anything, they could be like, look, it's her child. They're all her. It's not the servant's children, it's my children. Anyway.
So this custom, as recorded in Genesis, best fits with the Bronze Age and not the later Iron Age. Earlier in Genesis, Abraham says his heir was Eleazar of Damascus, since he still had no children of his own. Parallel texts from this time period can be found at Babylon and Mari and speak of a
If a man who had adopted a son and reared him, founded a household, and had children, wish to put this adopted son out, then the son shall not simply go his way. His adoptive father shall give him of his wealth 1/3 of a child's portion, and then he may go. Shall not give him of the field, garden, and house. Okay.
adopted heirs. In Genesis 23, Abraham negotiates the purchase of a cave to bury Sarah from a Hittite who owned the land. Abraham said he only wanted the cave, which would have been economically pragmatic, since in Hittite law, owning all the land would incur tax.
Now, when it comes to taxes, you best believe they're gonna go by the law. You best believe it. That's a different matter. We're just talking going 70 to 65. That might be up to the officer's discretion. But when it comes to taxes, oh boy, they gonna get it. Generally speaking, historically speaking. But I could be just applying modern standards to back then, potentially. If in a village someone holds fields as an inheritance share, if the large fields has been given to shall render the lose these services, but if the smaller part of the field has been given to him, he shall not render the lose these services. Interesting. Alright.
But not if he just owned the cave. Hess notes that Ugarit, Nuzi, and Alalak, the special inheritance of the firstborn, could be legally transferred, which is seen in the Genesis narratives with Abraham and Eliezer, Jacob and Esau, Joseph over Reuben, and Ephraim instead of Manasseh. At Nuzi, a custom is spoken of where an heir is adopted and marries the daughter of the adopter. This seems to correlate with the account of Jacob, where Laban accepts him as his own and allows him to marry his daughters. Also at Nuzi is a custom of a woman being adopted with the condition she be married by the adopter's son. Interestingly enough, both Abraham and Isaac tend to call their wives their sisters.
Hmm. Martha sold their daughters or sisters into what are euphemistically called adoptions. Proves that the adopters shall marry the girls off.
We also see that household idols were seen as proof of ownership by the adopter's son. Interestingly enough, both Abraham and Isaac tend to call their wives their sisters.
Well, in the context, well, also, I think in that text, the one with Abimelech, king of Gerar, I think Abraham explains that Sarah's actually like his half sister. So it's like, well, it's kind of okay because she's my half sister or something like that. But their explanation in the Bible was like Abraham was like, they concerned about getting killed. It's just very strange, but you never know. You never know. Yeah, my sister, for he feared to say my wife, thinking lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebecca. Because if she's just his sister, then it's like, well, we don't, she's a single woman. She's married and we killed the husband. Now she's single again.
We also see that household idols were seen as proof of ownership of one's inheritance. This might explain why that when Jacob fled Laban, his wife Rachel took the idols to secure the inheritance of Laban's land, as this would assure it passed to her husband and her family. At Nuzi, the same phrase we find in Genesis, of their father consuming our money, refers to withholding a dowry, and would explain why she took the idols.
Oh, interesting.
Finally, Richard Hess and other scholars note there are distinct features of Genesis that do not match later Israelite practices and themes, thus indicating the accounts of Genesis contain features that would not support the later Israelite goals or customs. First, Genesis 12-50 reports nothing on the destruction of pagan idols or altars, which was a very important issue later during the periods of monarchy. There is also no contest between Yahweh and the pagan gods, like we see later. Their role in the Promised Land is not to purify it of any of those already occupying it. The Genesis narratives would not have helped the biblical authors in their quest to end pagan worship. Abraham was also a foreigner in the land, which would not support their claim that they had a right to rule Canaan. We also see no mention of the god Baal, or later gods that threaten the monolatry of Yahweh. This fits more with an earlier time period, before Baal was exalted to the position of Most High in Canaanite religions. And it also would not help later Israelite authors who were trying to end Baal worship in Israel. Also, we see things in Genesis that would have been counterproductive for the later Israelites. Abraham and his descendants worship in a manner that includes mention of trees and pillars where Abraham placed altars, but not of prescribed places of worship or of Sabbath or food laws.
Yeah, because
So basically, Abraham does not promote dietary laws and worships in a way that was not allowed in later times within Israelite culture. Their moral behavior also doesn't really help promote Mosaic laws. In fact, there is also a lack of ritual purity and holiness in the patriarchal narratives. Jacob marries two sisters. Judah and Simeon marry Canaanites, and Joseph marries an Egyptian, all of which was condemned in Mosaic law. Both Isaac and Jacob give a larger inheritance to a younger son, something also frowned upon in the Mosaic law. Joseph had a cup which he used for divination, which was directly outlawed later in Deuteronomy. Walter Moberly says, if patriarchal religion
honestly, when I read that part about Joseph, I thought he was deceiving, making it appear even more that he was Egyptian, because that would have been common for an Egyptian. I actually didn't. I thought he was kind of making that up. But who knows? Maybe he did practice divination. I mean, I guess the interpretation of dreams, maybe that's in the realm of divination. Interesting.
religion corresponds to some kind of historical reality, then presumably this is either some form of a genuinely ancient pre-Yahwehistic religion or something that was an unorthodox strand within Yahwehistic religion.
Patriarchal corresponds to some kind of historical reality, then presumably this is either some form of genuinely ancient yeah, there's no like, doesn't seem like there is any set orthodoxy. Yeah, because this is really like, there was a mention, hold on, I believe Abraham mentioned God's law, which I don't know, that was odd to me. Where was it? Where was it? Can't remember, but there was something about practices, God's practices and laws, which I was like, huh, I didn't even realize. But maybe it was definitely not in the realm of Leviticus. And also there was like, one of the dudes he interacted with was considered priest of God Most High. So, don't know what to make of that, especially because that person's coming from what could have been considered a different cultural lineage, but not by much. Not by much. I mean, I think people haven't really consolidated, you know what I mean, to that point. Some people had, but for the most part, doesn't appear that most people had consolidated to that point. Again, sometimes, yeah, I don't know exactly where it took place. Oh, we're all right. Should get there. Where was that? I forget. If I didn't take notes on that, I'll feel kind of silly because I thought that was interesting and worth taking a note on it. Anyway, yeah.
Prior to Josiah's reforms. The difficulty with the latter suggestion is precisely the complete lack of that holiness and exclusiveness, which is one of the most fundamental characteristics of Yahwehism. So the account of Abraham fits with a pre-Mosaic time period, before more revelation was revealed to Israel and a new covenant was formulated.
Well, yeah, that also follows the biblical narrative. He's pre-Moses. Really, you don't say, Dickie. Oh, he's before Leviticus. Well, that makes sense to me. I don't know how somebody could conclude otherwise. It'd be very strange.
Now here's the main point. Individually, none of these points would amount to much. However, combined, they form a strong case the Genesis narrative of Abraham and his descendants are historically accurate accounts.
Well, it provides evidence to suggest that it is plausible. It is very plausible. It being historically accurate, that is, you know, if you write a fictional character and you set them in, you know, 1975 and you talk about them getting a caramel mocha latte at Starbucks, you might be like, that seems out of place. But if you set that character, a fictional character, in 2010 and everything that you talk about, you know, the type of cell phones that they were using, the type of this, that, and the other, well, this also supports that person must have lived because they followed the same custom. If you're gonna write a story, why wouldn't you use the same understandings of what is taking place in that time period? Of course you would, because it would be completely out of place for somebody to have a caramel mocha latte in 1970. I don't even think Starbucks was what Starbucks is like, what, early 1990s that it came about? You get what I'm saying? So I wouldn't use this as that it proves that this is historically accurate, only that we're narrowing down the time frame that if Abraham lived, this would have been the time frame that he lived. It lines up. Because, yeah, what?
They form a strong case the Genesis narrative of Abraham and his descendants are historically accurate accounts.
Yeah, that part right there. That they are historically accurate accounts. More like historically congruent with the time period of the Middle Bronze Age. That's what I would say. Which is, you know, which is compelling evidence, which is fascinating, which is, you know, I wouldn't say, see this, we wouldn't call this, I wouldn't call this isn't archaeological evidence. This is more like, well, it took some archaeology to, you know, yeah, translate the Mari text and this, that, and the other. So some archaeology went into bringing up these points. It would have been more compelling. It would be more compelling to have a tablet in cuneiform that mentions any of these characters. Any of these characters. You know, the fact that they're naming cities that existed. Oh my gosh, that's it. That's so impressive. What? Why? I mean, okay, they're not making up. Okay, they're not talking about Atlantis. Okay, that's a good start. You know, they're not completely, these aren't completely made up, far-flung, non-existent places. It's a good start, you know what I mean, to build a case that this potentially took place. So yeah, I mean, it's like, as far as timeline goes, Middle Bronze Age seems likely. As far as this research is concerned, it seems decently plausible. It, you know, let's keep going.
If you were a Jew living in the Iron Age or in Babylon, you might get one or two things correct about the Middle Bronze Age, but you're unlikely to get all of these data points correct and then weave them into a coherent narrative.
A coherent narrative. Some of this is a little incoherent. Also, yeah, again, historically accurate I think is a bit over the top. Definitely as far as that this is a story that had been passed down for a long time. I think that what the case that he's making is that this was not fabricated during the Iron Age, especially because by the Iron Age, so much had taken place, and it's not like people kept really good records of these things. I don't even know if people were using cuneiform anymore, or even understood all the knick-knack paddywhacks of the Bronze Age. But if these stories survived all the way until the Iron Age, then maybe they did have a good understanding of how the middle. Oh gosh, here's the thing. If the story survived to the Iron Age, a story like this, all the way from the Middle Bronze Age, then they might have had a good enough understanding of the Middle Bronze Age to actually fabricate a story about the Middle Bronze Age. Oh gosh, oh, we've gone full circle. Ah, crap. Oh no. So, proof that this story survived all the way until the Iron Age is proof that the people had enough knowledge about the Middle Bronze Age to fabricate a story about the Middle Bronze Age.
Especially when archives, like what we find in Mari, were buried and lost until the modern era. A Jew in Babylon would not have had access to these documents to construct a legendary narrative of Abraham. The amount of
Well, he didn't need to. He had if this is basically if this story survived all the way to here, then it is plenty possible and probable that other stories survived. And if people were capable of reading cuneiform, oh, the texts of Mari weren't discovered until who knows when just because the texts of Mari weren't discovered in the modern era does not mean that, like, when were those texts last read? Are you saying that the texts of Mari were lost during the Middle Bronze Age? That's not how this works. They could have been lost or placed there during the Iron Age or further ahead and then rediscovered at in the modern times. Heck, they could have been placed there at 500 AD and then rediscovered. Do you know when the texts of Mari were actually placed in the place that they were found in the modern era? He's acting like they were lost in the Middle Bronze Age because we didn't discover it till the modern era. It's like that's not good logic, my friend.
of correct information and parallels we find in the Middle Bronze Age strongly indicates that the later authors of Genesis were not constructing a legend, but reporting what was accurately handed down to them.
This does not prove that what they're reporting was accurate. It's just proof that this is what, by the time they wrote it down, this is what they had to work with. Whether the facts, if this was 800 years after the fact, do you know how much time that is for things to get stretched and exaggerated, minimized, or forgotten? If it's so much of it is verbal and it's being passed down through different family structures, and then everybody comes back together 800 years later to write it down.
Now, some argue there are anachronisms in the text, which we will deal with in other videos, specifically with regards to camels and the Philistines. However, some argue there are additional anachronisms with regards to place names that would indicate Genesis dates to a later time period. For example, Genesis records that Abraham left Ur of the Chaldeans, but the Chaldeans were a later group that did not control the area until the Iron Age. But updating language and place names was also a standard practice in the ancient world. For example, there's an updated version of the Tale of Senue that dates to the 13th century BC in Cairo. Within it, the word for sea is updated to Yam, a Semitic loanword that was not used in the Middle Kingdom. The older location of Kedem is replaced with Kadesh. Likewise, the place names and titles in the text of Genesis would be expected to be updated over time without compromising the narratives as a whole. Just like today, we can say the Dutch founded New York, even though they called it New Amsterdam. Thus,
Yeah, that makes sense. No qualms for me over here.
given the archaeological data, we have good evidence to trust the narratives of Abraham as real historical accounts and not later legends developed for Israel. However, during the
Hold on.
just like today, we can say the Dutch founded New York, even though they called it New Amsterdam. Thus, given the archaeological data, we have good evidence to trust the narratives of Abraham as real historical accounts.
Again. Look, he's slinging what he wants to push, and I respect it. All right, he's done his due diligence. It's a good video, and I respect it. All right, no doubt about that. Just that one point of being like, so clearly it's historically accurate because of this, and I'm like, that's no, this gives you historical plausibility, and that's good. That's here. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for evidence. I'm looking for, you know, um, you know, I'm gonna write this video down in case I want to go back to it. I think I should have been taking notes on this video. I have to go back through and take notes. Shoot, I missed it. I'll write it down as a, you know, potential source.
And not later legends developed for Israel. However, during the life of Abraham, something cataclysmic happened. Within Canaan, the destruction of several cities occurred. Was this historical? Were Sodom and Gomorrah really destroyed by fire? We will investigate this in another video.
That's exactly why we appeal.
Didn't want to click that.
3 of the world's major religions.
All right. I think it's time for a schmuckety schmuck. Yeah, again, good video. That was my only qualm was him being like, this is historically accurate because we have there's connective tissue to the Middle Bronze Age. Like, no, it's just all this just proves is that most likely if Abraham lived, he lived during the Middle Bronze Age. That's what this proves. This doesn't prove that Abraham lived. Or that the Bible that now it's like the text is hence why what I mentioned earlier. Just because a few things that you find in the text are correct does not make the whole text correct. You know, now we can just gloss it over with the term accurate and leave it at that. Which for some people that's, you know, they just want to go, it's accurate, and leave it and keep going, because it's, you know, it can feel like herding cats if you go through this understanding that some parts are going to be more accurate than others, and you can't just take it all at face value. And I get why people don't want to herd cats, but here I am, looking to herd some cats. We're gonna need a lot of treats. All right. Be right back. Cigarette break. I mean, the main takeaway from this video is that evidence strongly suggests that Abraham lived during the Middle Bronze Age. That's primarily what I got from that, which is good. That is good. Ooh, what is this? Does Bronze Age art support? Oh my gosh, we're going back and forth. We're going from inspiring philosophy to back to useful charts. Why not? Let's go.
That all 37 of those people, indicated here with a verification checkmark, lived during the Iron Age or later. This is because the Bible is basically an Iron Age book, meaning that it was during the Iron Age that the Bible started to be written. To put it another way, by the time the biblical authors put ink to parchment, the Bronze Age was already a distant memory, and therefore they had to rely on a lot of guesswork, mixed with imagination, to come up with stories from earlier times. Which is why Genesis and Exodus read more like myth and legend than, say, 2 Kings, which includes a lot of historical details that nicely line up with what we know from other sources. Now, while critical scholars are all basically in agreement about all of this, there are still some people from certain religious circles who continue to believe that the Bible is 100% literal history. These people sometimes cite certain archaeological finds as evidence for biblical characters from the Bronze Age. Therefore, in today's video, I'm going to take a look at some of these claims, and I'm going to do so with the help of Religion for Breakfast, Tablets and Temples, Dig It with Raven, Al-Muqaddimah, and Digital Hammurabi. But before we jump into it, I want to tell you about a shortcast that I've been listening to on Blinkist. A shortcast is simply a short podcast, and Blinkist has lots of them. As you might know, Blinkist is a website and app that provides you with the main ideas of over 6,500 books, which you can either read or listen to, usually in less than 30 minutes, and sometimes in even less than 15. I often check out a book on Blinkist before making a decision on whether or not I want to purchase and read the whole book. Well, Blinkist also has shortcasts, such as Dan Snow's History Hit. I recently listened to this episode entitled Archaeology, Discoveries, and Historical Biases. In fact, it helped me in preparing this video, and I think you'd like it too. So if you'd like to get a 7-day free trial and 40% off Blinkist annual premium, just click the link in the description or pinned comment. Or you can scan the QR code on screen right now. All right, back to the Bronze Age. Let's begin by...
All right, this time we're gonna take notes while we watch. I should have been taking notes. One thing I wrote down from that last video was check out the Mari text. They might bring up in this one. Check out the Mari text. All right. Okay, let's get ready. Where does All right, let's roll.
Taking a closer look at where the division between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age occurs on our biblical family tree chart. Basically, the dividing line would look something like this. So, characters such as the 3 patriarchs, as well as Moses, all belong in the Bronze Age, whereas characters like Devorah, Ruth, David, and Samuel belong in the early Iron Age. As mentioned in our previous video, the earliest Israelite leader for whom we have a contemporary extra-biblical source for is Omri. We do have an earlier mention of David outside of the Bible, but it's not actually from a contemporary source, as it only mentions him as being the ancestor of a later king. So if we want a contemporary source, then no, we don't actually have anything for David. However, when it comes to non-Israelites mentioned by name in the Bible, we do have someone even earlier than Omri, and that is Shoshank I. Being that he was a pharaoh of Egypt, we have lots of contemporary extra-biblical sources for him. Okay, so the goal of this video is to see if we can get a verification checkmark for anyone even earlier than Shoshank, and in particular, someone on the Bronze Age side of this big blue line. So let's start with who I think is the best possible candidate for making this happen. He's not actually shown on this family tree chart, but if he was, he'd be placed somewhere here as a contemporary of Moses. I'll let Dr. Andrew Mark Henry from Religion for Breakfast explain more.
Balaam son of Beor is one of the more mysterious figures in the Bible, a non-Israelite prophet who does the bidding of the God of Israel, only to be later cast as a villain and killed by the Israelites. He appears in the book of Numbers chapter 22. The Israelites are nearing the end of their 40-year wander through the wilderness after escaping from Egypt, and they're camped on the plains of Moab, just northeast of the Dead Sea and modern-day Jordan. And the Moabites are understandably alarmed. The Israelites have just destroyed a few of their neighbors, and the Moabites are afraid that they're next. So the king of Moab decides to hire Balaam, who was famous for his very effective blessings and curses. Maybe with some supernatural help, with Balaam cursing the Israelites, the Moabites can properly defend themselves. While Balaam journeys to Moab on a donkey, God grows angry with him and sends an angel to block his path. The donkey can see the angel, Balaam can't, and while Balaam is striking the donkey trying to get it to move, the donkey starts talking and is like, "Hey, why are you doing this to me?" Finally, Balaam sees the angel of the Lord who says, "You can go to the Moabites, but speak only what I tell you to speak." And so when Balaam arrives, instead of cursing the Israelites, he blesses them in a series of 4 poetic oracles. Now, up until the 1960s, that's basically all we knew about Balaam, along with a few other passing references in the Bible. But in 1967, archaeologists discovered an inscription on a few pieces of plaster at an archaeological site called Deir Allah. The Deir Allah inscription dates to around 8.
Yeah, we're getting a little ahead of Genesis here if that's happening in Numbers. Still interesting, and still, I think, due to the fact that, like, the Torah as a whole, is viewed as written, in the Iron Age, this is still fine. It's fine for our purposes. At least it's interesting. I mean, might have to bookmark some of these for later.
800 BCE, and it's written in a Canaanite dialect with some similarities with Aramaic. It starts, "This is the book of Balaam, son of Beor, a seer of the gods. The gods came to him at night, and he beheld a vision in accordance with El's utterance." So here we have an extra biblical reference to a seer named Balaam. Critical scholars agree that this is referencing the same character that we see in Numbers. The text describes the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon, El, coming to him with a message of disaster. The gods have banded together. The Shaddai gods have established a council, and they have said to the god of Shagar, "Sew up, close up the heavens with a dense cloud. That darkness exists there, not brilliance." So Balaam learns of a plan from the Shaddai, some sort of divine council of gods who oppose the chief god El, and they're planning to blanket the land in darkness. The text, as you can see, is very fragmentary, but it seems that Balaam successfully averts the Shaddai's plan. The story in Numbers and the Deir Allah inscription demonstrate that Balaam was a known character in the region east of the Jordan River. Now, some scholars think he was a historical figure, some sort of wandering prophet for hire, but at the very least, this is evidence of a shared tradition in the region about a heavily mythologized celebrity prophet. When we compare this inscription with the Book of Numbers, we can see how Israelite religion was embedded in the local cultural context and has affinities with other religious traditions in the region. In the Deir Allah inscription, Balaam is a prophet for the chief god El, and in several instances in his oracles in the Book of Numbers, he refers to the God of Israel as El. We see something similar with the Council of Gods in the Deir Allah inscription called the Shaddai. Shaddai is a plural form of the word Shaddai, which appears in Balaam's oracles referencing the Israelite God. The oracle of Balaam who hears the words of El, who sees the vision of the Shaddai, usually translated as God and the Almighty respectively. And narratively speaking, scholars have pointed out similarities between the story in Numbers and the inscription. Both include poetic oracles, and both include the plot point of having a vision at night that's then reported the next morning. Scholars argue that this means the story in Numbers knows what a Balaam story should sound like. In other words, if Balaam is a stock character in the local folklore, then it would have been a literary convention to include a nocturnal vision. So scholars generally agree that the Deir Allah inscription and at least parts of the story in Numbers derive from the same cultural context, though repackaged for different audiences. Now, none of this proves the historicity of the story in Numbers. The Deir Allah inscription dates to the Iron Age, around 800 BCE. The Book of Numbers describes a narrative that claims to be situated in the Late Bronze Age, maybe around the 15th century BCE. But Numbers itself, the book, was composed centuries later, also during the Iron Age. So we're talking a span of hundreds of years between the supposed events of Numbers 22 and the date of composition of both the Deir Allah inscription and Numbers 22. It's more likely that both of these texts are drawing on a local tradition about Balaam that was circulating east of the Jordan River in the 9th to 7th centuries BCE. The story in Numbers also seems to reflect the political reality of the Iron Age, when the kingdom of Moab was a frequent rival of the Israelite kingdoms.
So, as Dr. Henry explained, it is possible that Balaam was in fact a real historical person. However, the extra biblical source we have for him comes from the Iron Age, not the Bronze Age. So in other words, it's not a contemporary source. Or it could be that Balaam actually lived in the Iron Age, and that the biblical authors simply placed him further back in time. Either way, we can't give Balaam the same kind of verification that we can give to Shawshank or Omri. Balaam's verification would be more at the level of David. Regardless, the Deir Allah inscription is an amazing find, and does at least open the possibility that the Bible contains a reference to a real Bronze Age person who was important enough in the region that his name was remembered centuries later. Let's now take a look at the most important biblical figure from the Bronze Age, Moses. Is there any evidence in the archaeological record of him? Well, there's one particular inscription that some argue does in fact mention Moses. I'm going to let PhD candidate Lachlan Davis from the up-and-coming YouTube channel Tablets and Temples tell you more.
This is the Sinai 361 inscription, one of several carved inscriptions discovered near an ancient mining site on the Sinai Peninsula. Bold claims have been made that these texts contain the name Moses, as well as descriptions of events from the Exodus, such as Moses performing miracles and creating a bronze serpent statue. The inscriptions date to the 2nd millennium BCE and are written in Proto-Sinaitic, the oldest known alphabetic script, from which the Phoenician and Paleo-Hebrew alphabet is descended. So are these writings evidence for Moses and the Exodus? One such advocate is Dr. Douglas Petrovich, who translates the inscription as follows. Our bound servitude has lingered. Moses then provoked astonishment. It is a year of astonishment because of the lady. Such a reading evokes images of slavery and miracles performed by Moses in the book of Exodus. Another translation by
Wait, what? How do we get there? Our bound servitude had lingered.
Then provoked astonishment. It is a year of astonishment because of the...
Wait. How do we get to the next portion? Bound servitude had lingered, then provoked astonishment. It is a year of astonishment because of the lady. The lady? Okay. Interesting.
The lady. Such a reading evokes images.
Such a reading evokes images? Does it? Is it? Did anybody else have evoked images?
Of slavery and miracles performed by Moses in the book of Exodus. Another translation.
Did I hear that correctly? I'm confused. Hold on.
Astonishment because of the lady. Such a reading evokes
Is he quoting the book? Maybe he's quoting the book.
Images of slavery and miracles performed by Moses in the book of Exodus. Another translation by Professor Kramalkov reads, "This is the site of where stood the snake of bronze that Moshe, meaning Moses, Mahub Ba'alt made." He argues this is a reference to the bronze serpent Moses created in the book of Numbers. While these sensational claims are exciting, the reality is these translations have been heavily criticized, and the texts likely don't say Moses at all. The Hebrew name Moses comes from the Egyptian word Messi, meaning to give birth, and has S as its middle letter. However, translators who found Moses in the Sinai inscriptions have mistaken a letter for the Phoenician S sound when it is actually a Sinaitic TH letter, as in thin. So if the word is a name, it's probably Mat, which means twin in Ugaritic. The scholar Dr. Aaron Wilson Wright has demonstrated that these sensational Moses translations rely on restoring words that aren't in the inscription and inventing new meanings for other words. So she proposes the following translation: O returner, those who tell people about Maat, a beloved of the lady. The lady is the Egyptian goddess Hathor. This
is it? This feels very this lady. This is the lady. All right, maybe they'll explain. It's like, okay.
This is a common expression among the Sinai inscriptions. Another text, Sinai 351, reads, "Beloved of the lady are those who tell people about Maat, the miner and extractor." And still another 349 calls Maat the chief of miners. It appears these inscriptions commemorate a mining official, possibly named Maat, and offer blessings from Hathor. The texts make no reference to Moses, snakes, or miracles, but they are a fascinating example of writing in the world's oldest alphabet, and scholars are continuing to work on deciphering them.
Okay, so maybe those inscriptions don't refer to Moses, but there's lots of other evidence for the Exodus, right? Well, no. In recent years, several popular documentaries have come out which claim to go through lots of evidence for the Exodus, but in each case, the evidence presented is extremely flimsy and has not been verified by any actual experts. So for this topic, I'm going to let a real archaeologist, Raven De Silva from the channel Dig It with Raven, explain further. She has a new book coming out called The Other Ancient Civilizations, Decoding Archaeology's Less Celebrated Cultures, which I'll leave a link to in the description. Over to you, Raven.
2 stone pillars flank the Gulf of Aqaba in the Red Sea. Supposedly, they were erected by King Solomon to commemorate the crossing of the Red Sea by the Hebrews after they were freed by Moses. But are these pillars actual archaeological evidence of this biblical event?
Again, we are still feel like this is again decent, but it's not really hitting on Genesis at all, unfortunately. All right, let's just keep going.
Let's get into it. In 1978, Ron Wyatt, an American nurse anesthetist and amateur archaeologist who claimed to have made over 100 biblical archaeological discoveries, found a red granite pillar at the Egyptian side of the Gulf at Nuweiba. According to his report, it was found on its side in the water itself, but today you can find it on the side of a road erected in concrete about 500 feet away from the beach. Wyatt said that there was supposedly an inscription, or there should have been an inscription on this pillar that had since been eroded away, and he also said that it was of Hebrew or Phoenician origin and dated to around 3,000 years old. I tried to look at this pillar and date it off of the photos and biblical documentaries that are out there, but there aren't really many very detailed, high-quality images of this pillar, so it's really difficult to do so. I can't tell you how old it is with any confidence, but looking at the design of this pillar, I don't know about you, but it looks very nondescript to me. That means it could be from anywhere or any time throughout history, to be honest, unless we get a closer look at it and do some actual scientific research on it. The pillar doesn't have a capital, so that also doesn't really help in its identification. And when I think of Phoenician pillar, I think of this. Ron Wyatt himself did not do any scientific studies on it from what I've seen, because there are no peer-reviewed papers out there to actually talk about any of his discoveries. So again, there's nothing firmly documenting it anywhere, saying that it was from 3,000 years ago and it is of this design. In 1984, Wyatt claimed that he found a second pillar directly opposite Nuweiba on the opposite side of the Gulf in Saudi Arabia. It was apparently immediately removed by Saudi authorities, but it was apparently inscribed with the following words on it: Yahweh, Pharaoh, Mizraim, or Egypt, Moses, death, water, Solomon, and Edom. In what context? Wyatt didn't say. He also didn't mention any fragments of words or other words that maybe were, connecting words or sentence words. And he didn't mention like the placement of the words or what context. There's no rubbing of the words or any photographic evidence of the words. So it all just seems very convenient and keyword themed. It's almost like he was doing SEO for a pillar. There's that extra layer of convenience as well, because it was a mysterious pillar that was found and then it was swiftly taken away immediately, only to have like a plaque in Saudi Arabia marking where it was, and that's literally the only physical remains that we have, is this like little commemorative plaque on the other side of the Red Sea. If Wyatt had taken any sort of photos of the pillar or again inscriptions, anything like that, then we can maybe talk about its legitimacy and a little bit more of the dating and its connection to the one in Nuweiba. But until then, it's one of those things where the jury's out and you won't be able to convince me until I see some hard scientific evidence. I also quickly want to point out that King Solomon supposedly erected these pillars 400 years after the Red Sea crossing apparently happened. Even if he did erect these pillars, that doesn't actually mean that the crossing of the Red Sea happened. People erect religious monuments all the time, and if it was so long after it happened, it doesn't actually confirm that this event took place. What I do find interesting is that Ron and his sons found and photographed supposed coral-encrusted chariot pieces at the bottom of the Red Sea, as well as chariot wheels and bones belonging to both humans and horses. Apparently some of the wood that they found had gold gilding on it, but it was too deteriorated and fragile to actually be removed from the water for any further scientific study. Images of these finds were shown to Dr. Nassif Mohammed Hassan, the director of Egyptian antiquities at the time, though whenever I Google his name, only biblical websites come up, But Dr. Hassan claimed that one of the wheels was from the 18th dynasty. Apparently, this is the only time that an 8-spoked wheel was used in ancient Egypt, which does include the reign of Ramesses II. I'm not an expert in Egyptian chariots, so I can't tell you like how many spokes were used for the wheels throughout all of Egyptian history, but I can show you an image of Ramesses II in a chariot when he was fighting the Hittites. Overall, there's just a lot of speculation and looking at something that could fit and making a claim without any sort of scientific evidence to back you up. Also, I'm sorry, you can't look at this coral formation and immediately claim that it's an entire ancient set of chariot wheels still attached to its axle.
Yeah, that would probably was deteriorated snap by now. After this long. I don't know, I ain't no expert. Maybe the coral's reinforcing it, and it's actually not going to snap it. It would actually reinforce it. I don't know.
All of the overlays on these bits of coral supposedly marking out all of the spokes on a wheel are just wild.
Yeah, that's some Lamau right there.
Wild to me. I'm not an underwater archaeologist, but this just looks... It just doesn't look right. Doesn't look right at all. Apparently a human femur that Ron Wyatt found in the Red Sea was tested at Stockholm University, and it was determined that it came from a man about 165 to 170 centimeters tall. But from what I saw, there was no documentation stating actually how old it was. So again, it could just be a bone. It might have just been a bone that was in the sea from someone else at any other point in history. Contrary to some beliefs, archaeology is in fact a science, and we don't make any conclusions unless there is irrefutable evidence that has been checked multiple times by varying methods. So until there are proper archaeological tests, surveys, excavations, to me the Pillar of Solomon will remain simply a pillar in my eyes, and all of the coral remains underneath the water will simply be a rich, biodiverse home for sea life.
So yeah, this all boils down to how archaeology actually works in the real world. You can't just say, oh, I found this thing, but oops, I didn't take photos, and now it's gone. Or I think these fuzzy photos kind of look like wheels, but no expert has ever seemed bothered to take a closer look at them, even though the government of Egypt makes lots of money off tourism and is usually more than willing to examine just about anything if they think it is legitimate.
Whoa. I've heard some contrary to that belief about Egypt being very open about their archaeology. There are plenty of stories of them not wanting Egypt might take a look at it, but they're getting a little finicky on letting outsiders take a look at it. Yeah. Or to do extensive research. I mean, it doesn't happen, only that I'm just saying, I've heard rumors. I've heard rumors that they're a little not as open as what is being expressed here. I could be wrong. He could be right. I don't know.
So the bottom line is, major discoveries are always reported in peer-reviewed journals. So
they should be. They should be.
That other experts can chime in and either debate things or verify things. They are not announced via commercially made documentaries. This general principle can be applied to lots more.
I mean, they can be done through commercial means if they think that is a better route to disseminate the information. You know, let's not be too elitist about these things.
Ridiculous claims that biblical literalists make, such as that this structure in Turkey is Noah's Ark.
No, that definitely is. Can't you see? Just open your mind. Just visualize the boat, and there it is. Yeah, no. I mean, it's a cool looking mound. It's very unique mound, but yeah. Probably not Noah's Ark. But a very cool looking hill, don't you think?
Or that this statue is Joseph, because it comes from around the right time and place, and the figure appears to be wearing a multicolored coat. But
I mean, isn't that significant? Because I'd have to rewatch that video. So I think there's more than just the multicolored cloak. Because I think it's also that there's some other things about it that's unique, that's different from other, like I think there's something about where it's like clearly this person isn't an Egyptian, like per se, like he's, you know, there's some evidence to suggest he is of Semitic origin.
just because something seems to fit the biblical narrative, it doesn't automatically mean that it does.
Well, sure, but seems to fit that's where you start. You gather evidence, and then when you feel like you have enough evidence, you present your findings. You know, it seems to fit. Well, sure. That the whole documentary wasn't like, he's got a colored cloak. We did it, folks. We found Joseph. Case in point, it's done. Like, there was more in that video than just that, if I recall. So let's not be too disingenuous about other arguments out there.
Okay, so when it comes to Moses and the Exodus story, there's currently no archaeological evidence.
But the principles that he's putting forward here, I agree with. I just don't think that his own evidence that he's using to establish and explain this principle feels a little overly targeted in that instance.
Evidence that points to a person like the Bible describes, or an event like the Bible describes. Now, that doesn't mean that there was definitely no Moses-like person. Probably the story is based on something, but it's safe to assume that the biblical version of Moses and the Exodus is more literature than it is literal history. But what about the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? When it comes to them, there's a claim out there that goes far beyond just finding their names etched into stones. In this case, some people believe that we actually know their precise burial place. Muslims in particular believe that at this site in Hebron, known as the Cave of the Patriarchs, lay not only the actual bones of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but of Adam and Eve as well. I'll let the useful charts animate.
Yeah, the Adam and Eve part sounds wild. Wild. What, did Noah carry their bones onto the ark with him? Is that going to be the claim?
Siawish Rayman, who also hosts the Islamic history channel Al Mukarrama, explain.
In 638 CE, the Holy Land came under the control of the youngest of the three Abrahamic religions, Islam. The Rashidun Caliphate, under Caliph Omar ibn al-Khattab, conquered cities like Jerusalem, Gaza, and Hebron, which marked the transfer of the biblical holy sites, many of which are holy to Muslims, Jews, and Christians, to Muslims. While the Caliphate didn't persecute religious minorities and even protected many of their sacred sites, such as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, many other sites were converted to the Islamic tradition and made into mosques. Among these newly Islamized mosques was the Ibrahimi Mosque, which was previously a Byzantine-era basilica enclosed in a Herodian-era complex. This complex was built shortly before the birth of Jesus on top of a cave known as the Cave of the Patriarchs. It's called that because according to the traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, this is where the patriarchs and their wives are buried. It's said that the patriarch Abraham, known as Ibrahim in Islam, bought this cave when his wife Sarah passed away. Then Abraham, his son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob were buried along with their wives Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah, respectively. According to some sources, Adam and Eve are buried there as well. The complex that we see today was built by King Herod the Great of Judea shortly before Jesus was born. However, Josephus, who wrote so much about Herod's construction projects, doesn't give him credit for the complex. In 2020, a paper was published that mentioned pottery found at the site from multiple cities that dated as far back as the 8th century BCE. This puts the site as a location that was visited by people, maybe from all over the Holy Land, as far back as during the days of the Kingdom of Judah. The Babylonian exile was still some 2 centuries in the future at this point. What we know as Judaism today, which is in fact Rabbinic Judaism, didn't exist in its current form at all. However, while the 8th century BCE is quite far back, it's still around 1,000 years after Abraham is supposed to have lived, which is around 1800 BCE or so. Now, according to the vast majority of academic scholars, Adam, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are purely mythological characters and did not, in fact, exist. Since they didn't exist, their burial sites didn't exist either. However, this didn't stop people from claiming to have found bones down there. During the Islamic era, it was forbidden to go into the caves below the complex as a form of respect for the patriarchs. However, there was a brief period of around a century, the 12th century to be precise, when the Holy Land was under Christian control, after the First Crusade. During this period, the caves were more accessible and a monk claimed to have found bones there. Although many sites around the world claim to be burial sites for various biblical and Quranic figures, there are even multiple places claiming to be the burial place of the same person. So the whole thing isn't very scientific.
Okay, so it's safe to
say they didn't prove it, but they didn't disprove it. Also, at this point, I mean, again, even if they found the right cave, what's the likelihood that they would, other people might have been buried there throughout the years and what have you. I don't know. It's going to be very difficult to prove. Other than, well, this person's was from, from what we can tell, from maybe they find bones that they can scientifically go, well, these bones were from the Middle Bronze Age, but that's about it. It's like, okay, so people were being buried here. How are you going to even prove that it is who it is, unless there's some kind of like inscriptions on the wall? The fact that nobody's allowed to go down there since like the 12th century, I mean, unfortunate.
To say that the traceable activity at the Cave of the Patriarch site goes no further back than the Iron Age, even though...
Wait, hold on. How do we know that for sure? Did he prove that? Wait, what?
characters and did not, in fact, exist.
Oh, the earliest pottery. Well, when was the last time they were down there? If nobody's been down there, wait, when did they find the pottery?
However, Josephus, who wrote so much to give him multiple cities that dated as far back as the 8th century BCE. However, Josephus, who wrote so much about Herod's construction projects, doesn't give him credit for the complex. In 2020, a paper was published that mentioned pottery found at the site from multiple cities that dated as far back as the 8th century BCE.
From multiple cities? But if they're not allowed to go down there, that's just dating around the site. It doesn't sound like... Okay. Well, clearly they didn't dig down deep enough. They just found it around. They didn't actually do any excavation. From what this person is saying. And then Useful Charts is just like, there it is. There you have it. No activity before that time period. No, that's a... Have they done excavations?
A paper was published that mentioned pottery found at the site from multiple cities.
At the site from... Okay, so the pottery at the site. They didn't say in the cave. So at the site. So at the complex. But is he talking about in the cave?
That dated as far back as the 8th century BCE. This puts the site as a location that was visited by people, maybe from all over the Holy Land, as far back as during the days of the Kingdom of Judah. The Babylonian exile was still some 2 centuries in the future at this point. What we know as Judaism today, which is in fact Rabbinic Judaism, didn't exist in its current. Their burial sites didn't exist either. However, this didn't stop people from claiming to have found bones down there. During the Islamic era, it was forbidden to go into the...
I don't know. I'll take him at his word. I'll be like, all right, they went down. When he says at the site, I'm going to just assume that he means in the cave. But he didn't say that. At the complex, which means maybe they have like a basement area, or like maybe they have like artifacts that they've held as like sacred and they allowed them for scientific analysis, but they didn't go down into the actual cave structure. That's different. At the site, to me, I wish he just would have said they went down into the cave and that's where they found it. That would give me a very definitive, okay, at the site doesn't feel as specific as for me to go, okay, they went into the cave. And that's what they found.
Of people from the Bronze Age. So unless someone opens the tombs...
Also, oh, it's here, unless somebody opens the tombs.
And tests the supposed bones in there,
there
this
you go.
site cannot be used as evidence for the existence of any biblical character.
There you
And
go.
the same goes for the plethora of other sites, most of which are Islamic, which claim to hold the bones of other biblical characters, such as Abel, Noah, and Moses. Okay, so I'm actually going to end this video on a positive note. That's because there is one particular figure from the Bronze Age, for whom we have lots of contemporary evidence for, that might actually be mentioned by name in the Bible. So this is not a central biblical character, but rather a foreign figure that is maybe mentioned in passing in the biblical text. In fact, it's a Bronze Age figure whose name is very well known, Hammurabi, king of Babylon. So obviously for this last segment, I had to ask Assyriologist Dr. Joshua Bowen from the channel Digital Hammurabi for his thoughts.
In Genesis 14:1 we read, "Now in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tigal, king of Goyim." Who are these kings? Because Shinar is known to be another name for the land of Babylonia in the Hebrew Bible, this led scholars to look for a Babylonian king with whom to identify the first king, Amraphel. In the late 19th century, this king of Shinar was identified as Hammurabi, assuming that the Akkadian form of his name had been confused when brought into the Hebrew text. However, scholars later moved away from this view. A significant development came with the publication of 3 relatively late cuneiform texts that were likely copied from earlier texts during the early 1st millennium BCE, known as the Spartoli tablets. These texts describe 4 kings who fought against the city of Babylon. In the late 19th century, Pinchas, the scholar who published the tablets, read the name of one of the kings as Kedor-Laomer or Kedor-Laomer, and made a connection between this name and the Kedor-Laomer of Genesis 14. This led to scholars looking at the names of the other kings in the Spartoli tablets to see if they could make other connections to those in Genesis 14. In the tablets, the king of Babylonia was named Ibiltutu, and it was argued that this name referred to the Babylonian usurper Marduk-apla-iddina. The name Marduk is written in Sumerian Amar-Utu, and it was theorized that the writer of the biblical texts had at his disposal a shortened form of Marduk-apla-iddina's name, which consisted of the Amar of Amar-Utu and Apal, thus Amar-Apal, which found its way into the Hebrew text as Amraphel. Recently, in a monograph about the history of the city of Babylon, Stephanie Dalley presented the current opinions on this passage in an appendix entitled Genesis 14, 1-16, and possible links with foreign rulers early in the reign of Hammurabi. There she notes that, although scholars abandoned the early notion that Genesis 14 referred to kings from the time of Hammurabi, this has again come back to be a tenable position. About the name Amraphel, she writes, either Hammurabi with an unexplained suffix L, or Amud-Pl, king of Katna, with a common misreading of the letter R for D, possibly a confusion of the two names. Although research in the last 2 decades, particularly from material from the time of Hammurabi at the city of Mari, has moved scholars back toward identifying the Genesis 14 names, including Amraphel, king of Shinar, with kings from the time of Hammurabi, it would appear that we still do not possess enough information to draw definitive conclusions.
Okay, so that's a maybe, and a very interesting one at that. If the Amraphel mentioned in Genesis 14 is in fact a reference to the great king Hammurabi of Babylon, then that means that Hammurabi is the oldest known historical figure mentioned by name in the Bible. And it also means that we have verification for at least one Bronze Age person. Now, it actually makes sense that Hammurabi's name in particular might have found its way into the Bible. According to critical scholars, Genesis 14 was most likely written during the Babylonian captivity, which took place following 586 BCE. Being that Hammurabi was one of the most famous Babylonian kings of all time, it's not hard to believe that the Judahite scribes living in Babylon during the 500s might have heard about him and might have decided to work him into their nation's origin story. So the conclusion is still that there is a huge difference when it comes to the Bronze Age parts of the Bible and the Iron Age parts. The names of the main characters from the Iron Age section are relatively easy to find in the archaeological record, whereas the names of the main characters from the Bronze Age section are not. Likewise, the Iron Age parts contain lots of references to foreign individuals who are known to be real historical people, whereas the Bronze Age parts have at best just 2 references. Okay, so that was a look at the Bible and the Bronze Age. Special thanks to all my fellow YouTubers who helped with.
Okay. All right. I mean, I wasn't terribly, as far as evidence was concerned with Genesis, I didn't think that we were going to find anything of significance, because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob they're not kings. They're not great generals that would have been written about. They're just, seem like potentially Abraham seems like maybe like what would have been considered a middle class shepherd, like did well for himself, decently wealthy, but nothing crazy. Maybe along with Isaac, like they're all like anywhere in between, like, they were doing like just getting by to maybe middle class, maybe a little upper middle class there at a time, fluctuating in wealth as the times come and go. No reason for their names to really get written into other people's documentation. Until Joseph, and that's the one that Joseph would be a character that it would be very interesting to see, and that's where, what was it? Of Exodus, what was that? Yeah, patterns of evidence Exodus. Yeah. Might watch this on my own time.
The whole thing, from the beginning of the sojourn in Egypt, the slavery, Moses and the Exodus, the conquest of the Promised Land, is all there in one nice, neat line, but it's way too early.
I don't believe there was a single event that we can call the Exodus.
This person can't have seen all this. He imagined it.
I'm very much against chronological revisionism.
There is nothing else like this in the whole of Egyptian history.
Really?
Nothing at all.
When you put those cities side,
Yeah, the reason, because just Joseph's existence, whether we can find proper evidence for that. I mean, that's for my purposes. Chapter 37 through 50. However, whether or not everything that took place between him and his brothers, how that all went down, evidence of you're not gonna find evidence of there being a cupbearer or something like that. Maybe captain of the guard that had a prominent Hebrew slave, maybe. But again, yeah. But maybe the evidence of the famine, that brought them there, maybe there. See, I don't know if this is actually going to cover this. This is specifically about the Exodus out of Egypt. Yeah. Maybe I'll save this for, what are they charging? It's potential. But yeah, I guess I could check out the Mari text, but yeah, as far as finding evidence for, I guess we could look at biblical flood, or just foretold, confirmed. Place called Ark Encounter. See evidence for notes at the Grand Canyon. This feels like a completely a whole nother subject unto itself, which I don't know fits into my criteria specifically for the, almost like this evidence for the flood itself could be its own video, and I don't want this to take up the majority. That's not the point of this. It's just not trying to make a 3-hour video. Good gracious. But we've gotten some decent, kind of pointers on this. Is sort of evidence strongly suggests that Abraham lived during the Middle Bronze Age. I should check out the Mari texts. Let's see. Do the fact of the doublets that occurred shows multiple authors. Bible most likely written down in the Iron Age. That's an important thing to bring up. Obviously for any, going forward, that's going to apply. It's trying to put this into context. All right, I'm gonna do another cigarette break, and then we'll get back to it. Okay, where do we want to go from here? I guess we could look at the Mari text. That could be interesting. Oh, the Mari text. Also, something I was thinking about while I was on my smoke break. Do we have any just generic administrative texts from the Kingdom of Judah or Israel? You know, just generic. I mean, in some of the videos I've watched, they were talking about how most likely some of the stuff was written down in the Iron Age. You know what I mean? Like the Bible and what have you was first, you know, the Torah and everything was first written down. Do we still have like remaining any other just like generic, just as we have like generic texts of cuneiform and Egyptian texts of just administrative documents? I'm curious about that, but that's later on into the future. Just something I was thinking about. All right, what's this?
Holding a tablet that was written thousands of years ago and being able to read what it says, it's an amazing feeling.
If you see a cuneiform tablet for the first time, you're not likely to identify it as writing, and you certainly wouldn't know which way up it went.
It's a form of time travel. It catapults you back in time thousands of years and puts you directly into the shoes of someone.
The earliest known form of writing is called cuneiform. First used...
Okay, this is what I'm looking for. Mari text. What is this specific Mari text? This people referencing. What? I'm misspelling something, or is this like am I taking crazy pills? Isn't the my tag? I must have misspelled something. Huh. This could be interesting. Yeah, what is the Sumerian? And creation myth. I don't know. Could be interesting. Let's see what we got.
This production is brought to you by the World History Encyclopedia and the Study of Antiquity and written by Joshua J. Mark, narrated by D.W. Draffin. The Sumerian Flood Story, also known as the Eridu Genesis, Sumerian Creation Myth, Sumerian Deluge Myth, is the oldest Mesopotamian text relating the tale of the Great Flood, which would appear in later works such as the Atrahasis, 17th century BCE, the Epic of Gilgamesh, circa 2150 to 1400 BCE, and, most famously, the story of Noah and his ark from the biblical book of Genesis, circa 1450 BCE.
Wait, how do they have 1450 BCE? I think isn't that like late Bronze Age? Right?
The story is dated to circa 2300 BCE in its written.
This is again where it's like I don't confidence in other people's work. You know, their biases, they're this, they're that. I gotta take a lot of this with a grain of salt, because like, wait, 1450 BC. Where did you get that from? I thought it was written down in the Iron Age, which is like 1000 BC. Ay. We'll have to go through timelines, but
written form, but is thought to be much older, preserved by oral tradition until committed to writing. The extant work is badly damaged, with a number of significant lines missing, but can still be read and easily understood as an early Great Flood story. Scholars who have studied the text generally rely on the later Akkadian Babylonian Atrahasis, which tells the same tale, to fill in the blanks of missing text from the broken tablet. The story most likely influenced the Egyptian flood story known as the Book of the Heavenly Cow, dated in part to the first intermediate period of Egypt, 2181 to 2040 BCE, but certainly was the inspiration for the later Mesopotamian works as well as the biblical narrative of Noah. The story was first discovered in 1893 CE.
Supposedly. You know, just because you write it down first doesn't make it the, most accurate. But potentially, if it's written down first, it's the most widespread understanding in the area if it's written down. But that doesn't necessarily mean that other people couldn't have had their own stories about the Great Flood beforehand. It's like saying whoever reports first is the most accurate, which we kind of all know that is not the case. Generally, whoever reports the quickest on something is going to get some things wrong. Now, granted, I wouldn't say this is the quickest report that necessarily applies here, but you get what I'm saying. Is that just because you write it down first doesn't make your version the most accurate.
During the period of widespread expeditions and excavations throughout Mesopotamia, funded by Western institutions. The good man, in this version of the tale, chosen to survive the flood and preserve life on Earth, is the priest king Ziudsura of the city of Surapak, whose name means life of long days. This same figure appears as Atrahasis, exceedingly wise, in the later work that bears his name, as Utnapishtim, he found life, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and as Noah, rest or peace, in the Book of Genesis. Expeditions and discovery. In the 19th century CE, Western institutions, including museums and universities, funded expeditions to Mesopotamia in hopes of finding physical evidence which would corroborate the historicity of biblical narratives. The 19th century CE saw the unprecedented practice of increasingly critical readings of the Bible, which questioned long-held beliefs regarding its divine origin and supposed infallibility. This age of skepticism would see the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859 CE, suggesting that human beings, rather than being created by God as a little lower than the angels, Psalm 8:5, evolved from primates. In 1882 CE...
Can we get to the Sumerian epic of creation? Like, good Lord. Okay.
Prior to the rise of Q was encouraged by the work of the Archbishop James.
You have 21 minutes, and you're spending it on a different history lesson. Can we just get to actual story? That's what I care about.
Since the Bible had been written, dates the creation of the world to 22nd October, 4004, at 6 p.m. Since the Bible had been written by God, it was infallible and could be trusted not only in that they contained a number of stories, motifs, and symbols sent to Mesopotamia were supposed to find evidence supporting this view, but found the exact opposite. Cuneiform tablets, deciphered from the mid-19th century CE onwards, challenged the traditional view of the Bible directly in that they contained a number of stories, motifs, and symbols which appeared in the biblical narratives and predated them. Among these was the Sumerian flood story, the first known account of the tale people of the time knew as Noah's Ark. The badly damaged tablet was discovered in the ruins of the ancient city of Nippur by an expedition funded by the University of Pennsylvania in 1893 CE. It was left untranslated until 1912 CE when the German Assyriologist Arno Perbel, lived 1881 to 1958 CE, deciphered it as part of his job for the University of Pennsylvania. The existence of a pre-biblical account of Noah's flood suggested to some that the traditional interpretation of the Bible needed to be rethought, while to others that a Mesopotamian account of a great flood corroborated the biblical story, just from another point of view. The British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley, lived 1880 to 1960 CE.
Honestly, the fact that there is multiple accounts of, I think it corroborates the potential for a great flood. Where that means the rest of the details attached to such a story are accurate. is questionable. Doesn't even have to be a worldwide flood, just like a regional flood. And, you know, again, the details of how the flood came about, why it came about, all that stuff surrounding it is definitely in question. But there is potential that, you know, there could have been a great flood. That's why so many other cultures remember it.
CE challenged this later claim through.
Or it's just a great story, and that's why everybody has their own version. It's a fascinating tale.
His excavations at the ruins of ancient Ur in the 1920s CE. During the 1928-1929 CE excavation season,
Sumerian Epic of Creation. This is more about like them finding. Maybe this is. This wasn't what I was hoping it would
Woolley
be.
sank a series of shafts into the soil and determined there had been significant flooding in the region, but that this was a local, not global event, and further, was not a singular incident, but had happened a number of times when the Tigris and Euphrates rivers overflowed their banks. Woolley's excavations were mirrored elsewhere in Mesopotamia by other archaeologists who came to the same conclusion. The historicity and originality of the biblical narrative of the Great Flood could no longer be maintained, and Ussher's chronology was challenged and dismissed by scholars, although both are still maintained by Christians in the present day, who maintain the so-called young earth view. Scholar Stephanie Daly, commenting on further excavations in Mesopotamia, provided Woolley with the academic freedom to make the kind of assertions concerning the flood in the 1920s. See, the Sumerian gods who undertake the act of creation. The Sumerian flood story begins with the creation.
Finally, good gracious.
Which would have been unthinkable a mere century before. Summary. The Sumerian flood story begins with the creation of the world, the black-headed people, the Sumerians, and then the animals. The Sumerian gods who undertake the act of creation, An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag, would remain among the most powerful Sumerian deities for centuries, until they were eclipsed by Amorite theological paradigms under Hammurabi of Babylon, reigned 1792 to 1750 BCE.
I just want... Just give me... I'm such an old man. I'm like, I'm cranky as all get out. I'm like, can we just get to just tell me the tale? I don't need all this extracurricular activity.
Later, the Assyrians. After humans and animals are created, the gods decree the establishment of cities, beginning with Eridu, which was considered the oldest city in the world. Each of the cities are given to a god to oversee, thereby establishing the tradition of every city having its patron deity, and reference seems to be made to the further establishment of irrigation systems. After this section of the narration, a number of lines are missing, which must have explained why the gods An and Enlil, the leaders of the Sumerian pantheon, decide to destroy humanity with a great flood. In the later Atrahasis, the reason is that people become too numerous and too loud and disturb Enlil's rest. In Atrahasis, Enlil sends a drought, then a plague, and then famine to the earth to decrease the population and quiet the roar of the humans, but each time, Enki, god of wisdom and friend of humanity, tells the people what they should do to reverse Enlil's plagues, and they are able to go on with their lives as before. It is probable these details also appeared in the earlier Sumerian flood story where Enki has the same role. The story then continues, noting how all the gods swear an oath, presumably that they will not interfere in the An-Enlil decision to destroy humanity. And then the central character of the tale is introduced, Ziud-Sura, a king of the city of Surapak and a priest. Since Enki, presumably, has taken the oath not to interfere with the flood along with all the other gods, he cannot warn Ziud-Sura directly, and so speaks to a wall, knowing that Ziud-Sura on the other side of it will hear him. At this point, there are more lines missing, which would have detailed Ziud-Sura's creation of a large boat, which he filled with animals and the seed of mankind. The narrative resumes with a depiction of the flood, which rages for 7 days and 7 nights, until the seas quiet, and Utu Shamash, the sun god, appears. Ziud-Sura makes a hole in the side of the boat, and Utu, in the form of the sun's rays, enters. Ziud-Sura dutifully makes a sacrifice to the god, but what happens after is lost through more missing lines. In the end, An and Enlil seem to have repented of their decision, as they are grateful that Ziud-Sura has preserved their creations. They grant him eternal life in the paradise of the land of Dilmun. Based on fragments of the tablet, it seems the story continued after this seeming conclusion for another 39 lines, but the content is lost. Text. The following text comes from The Literature of Ancient Sumer, edited by the scholars Jeremy Black, Graham Cunningham, Eleanor Robson, and Gabor Zolyomi. The opening line referencing stopping the annihilation of my creatures might be suggesting that the gods initially gave human beings long lifespans as co-workers with the gods who would take on their labor and make the earth pleasant for them. As the The opening line referencing stopping the annihilation of my creatures might be suggesting that the gods initially gave human beings long lifespans as co-workers with the gods who would take on their labor and make the earth pleasant for them, as the story is given in Atrahasis. In this later work, after the flood, measures are taken by the gods to limit the human lifespan and increase mortality, and these kinds of details may have made up the missing text from the earlier Sumerian flood story which follows. I will stop the annihilation of my creatures, and I will return the people from their dwelling grounds. Let them build many cities, so that I can refresh myself in their shade. Let them lay the bricks of many cities in pure places. Let them establish places of divination in pure places. And when the fire quenching is arranged, the divine rights and exalted powers are perfected, and the earth is irrigated, I will establish well-being there. After An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag had fashioned the black-headed people, they also made animals multiply everywhere, and made herds of four-legged animals exist on the plains, as is befitting. Here there are approximately 32 lines missing. I will oversee their labor. Let the builder of the land dig a solid foundation. After the of kingship had descended from heaven, after the exalted crown and throne of kingship had descended from heaven, the divine rights and the exalted powers were perfected. The bricks of the cities were laid in holy places, their names were announced, and were distributed. The first of the cities, Eridu, was given to Nudimud, the leader. The second, Bad Tibira, was given to the mistress. The third, Larag, was given to Pabil Sag. The fourth, Zimbir, was given to Hero Utu. The fifth, Suropag, was given to Sud. And after the names of these cities had been announced and had been distributed, the river was watered. Here there are approximately 34 lines missing. Seat in heaven, flood, mankind. So he made. Then Nintud, holy Inanna, made a lament for its people. Enki took counsel with himself. An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag made all the gods of heaven and earth take an oath invoking An and Enlil. In those days, Ziud-Sura, the king, the Gudug priest, he fashioned. The humble, committed, reverent, day by day, standing constantly at something that was not a dream appeared, conversation, taking an oath by invoking heaven and earth in the Ki-Ur, the gods. A wall. Ziud-Sura, standing at its side, heard. Side wall, standing at my left side. Side wall, I will speak words to you. Take heed of my words. Pay attention to my instructions. A flood will sweep over in all a decision that the seed of mankind is to be destroyed has been made. The verdict, the word of the divine assembly, cannot be revoked. The order announced by An and Enlil cannot be overturned. Their kingship, their term, has been cut off. Their heart should be rested about this. Here there are approximately 38 lines missing. All the windstorms and gales rose together, and the flood swept over the land. After the flood had swept over the land, and waves and windstorms had rocked the huge boat for 7 days and 7 nights, Utu the sun god came out, illuminating heaven and earth. Ziud-Sura could drill an opening in the huge boat, and Hero Utu entered the huge boat with his rays. Ziud-Sura, the king, prostrated.
One thing that's very interesting about humanity as a whole is how the gods always seem very human, just with a lot of power. Like they don't, it's really just how they seem to operate in so many different religions and cultures. Even in Genesis, God acts more like just a dude with a lot of power. God doesn't come off as like some kind of wise or intelligent being that has all knowledge or something akin to that. Or even supremely loving. And it just seems like gods in general in the record just, I don't know, unimpressive is the best way I'd describe it.
Prostrated himself before Utu. The king sacrificed oxen and offered innumerable sheep. Here there are approximately 33 lines missing. They have made you swear by heaven and earth. An and Enlil have made you swear by heaven and earth. More and more animals disembarked onto the earth. Ziud-Sura the king prostrated himself before An and Enlil. An and Enlil treated Ziud-Sura kindly. They granted him life like a god. they brought down to him eternal life. At that time, because of preserving the animals and the seed of mankind, they settled Ziudsura the king in an overseas country in the land of Dilmun, where the sun rises. Here there are approximately 39 lines missing. Conclusion. The Sumerian flood story is considered the first written account of the popular myth of a worldwide flood, sent by divine agency, which appears in almost every culture of the ancient world. The seemingly universal treatment of the same story has suggested to some that there must have once been such an event, which people of different cultures independently responded to with the creation of the story. Modern-day scholars tend to reject this interpretation and instead suggest that an early story of a great flood and the destruction of humanity resonated with an ancient audience and came to be widely repeated, traveling through trade from one region to another. Each culture adapted the story to their own needs and vision, and so the original was altered to greater or lesser degrees as it was told, and then written down in different locales. The original may or may not have been the Sumerian flood story, but many scholars in the present day, including Stephanie Dalley, believe it was. Dalley writes, all these flood stories may be explained as deriving from the one Mesopotamian original used in travelers' tales for over 2,000 years, along the great caravan routes of Western Asia, translated, embroidered, and adapted according to local tastes to give a myriad of divergent versions. The concept of a god's wrath, or the collective displeasure of many gods, causing catastrophic events, was understood simply as how the world worked by ancient civilizations around the world. The story of the Great Flood would have served a number of purposes, but primarily explained the creation of the world as the people knew it, while strongly suggesting they pay greater attention to the divine will in their daily lives. In each version of the flood story mentioned above, the gods, or God, repent of their decision. In the Genesis story, God even places the rainbow in the sky as a promise he will never flood the world again. But to an ancient audience, this would not have meant that the divine could not as easily send some equally dire punishment for human transgression of its will at some point in the future, whenever it wanted to. The story would have then encouraged people to err on the side of caution in adhering to religious cultural precepts in order to maintain the goodwill of a deity or deities who could as easily destroy as support them.
All right. Interesting, interesting. Hmm. I don't know where to go from here. I couldn't find the Mari text. Let's Google this. It just doesn't make any sense. Mari archives. Ministry magazine. What is this? Maybe Mari tablets? You'd think just Mari text would bring it up. The tablets. I thought they were. See, I don't trust anything called biblical archaeology. I'm sorry. I just feel like their bias is going to be way too strong for me to tolerate. Like basically they're like it's not even that they're trying to be deceitful or anything like that. It's just going to be laced in there so heavily. What? Why are people referring to? Oh goodness. Hold on. Wasn't it inspiring philosophy? Isn't he the one that made mention fudge nuggets? Where was it? Hold on. It's called Abraham. Alright, biblical archaeology. I like how well, I've seen this guy before, okay? I'm already been subscribed to him for a while because I think he does a decent job. I'll still give people a fair shake, but generally it's like I respect the fact that he has so many views. I know that's kind of just the thing. If I see a 5-year-old video that has 2,000 views, I will think lesser of it than it is 369,000 views from 5 years ago. So let's see, where was it that he mentioned like the Mari text?
If you add up the dates in the Bible, Abraham would have existed in the early Bronze Age, sometimes also referred to as the Intermediate Bronze Age. Canaan. Not only is this true of Jacob and his sons in Genesis 37, but earlier in Genesis, Abraham says his heir was Eleazar of Damascus, since he still had no children of his own. Parallel texts from this time period can be found at Babylon and Mari and speak of a
Babylon and Mari. So nobody's like covered. Sure, people covered it, but
15. Instead of it matching the structure of later texts, like what we see in Jeremiah 34. Richard Hess notes a similar custom was found at the Bronze Age city of Alalak. The texts found there were written in the Old Babylonian script. One of these tablets describes the swearing of an oath and involves a ritual, not unlike that of Genesis 15. Wiseman's publication of this text, A.T. with declaring the gods as witnesses, followed by the swearing of an oath, stipulations, a ceremony.
Okay. What's interesting is Useful Charts doesn't go over, like, I get they wanted to use, like, archaeology in the sense of hard evidence, not suggestive comparisons. So I get that. That's why it's sort of like, I wouldn't call this hard evidence, just suggestive correlations, which is still something. It's not nothing. You know what I mean? It would have been interesting if like Useful Charts went through each one of these like claims here and tried to talk about them, because it did seem a little bit like you know, his title is Does Bronze Age Archaeology Support the Bible? And I don't think he looks at any, or there's nothing here that, you know, let's see.
Egypt. During the Intermediate Bronze Age, Egypt was experiencing something known as the First Intermediate Period, and the evidence suggests the Egyptians tried to keep travelers from Canaan out. However, things changed completely.
All right. Okay, so Mari text, nobody's really done a, I even tried to look at, like, Google it, but I'm not even, just put some question marks here. All right. I want to know who wrote it. When was it written? Yeah, that's more important to me. What time?
Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to show you our latest wall chart, which is a timeline of the Bible. Now, this is not a timeline of the events described in the Bible, it's a timeline of the Bible itself. In other words, it shows when each book of the Bible was written and how the books ended up being combined together into the format we have today. If you want to get a copy of the chart as a poster, you can get one now by going to our website, usefulcharts.com, or by clicking the link in the description or pinned comment. Last year, we did a series called Who Wrote the Bible, and this new chart is basically a summary of the information from those videos. If you haven't yet watched the series, I'll leave a link to the various episodes in the description as well. Okay, so the timeline starts with the year 931 BCE, which is one of the most important dates in biblical chronology. That's the year that King Solomon supposedly died, and therefore the year that the ancient Israelites split into two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. However, for historians, the year 931 BCE represents the start of verifiable Bible history. Everything before 931, from the reigns of David and Solomon all the way back to figures like Moses, Abraham, and Noah, are considered to fall within the realm of mythology and legend, whereas everything after 931 is generally set within a historical context. If you want to learn about the chronology that the Bible uses for the events that supposedly occurred...
Again, talk about bias. It's like, it's a done deal. They are legendary. They are myth. This is mythology, legend. I will... Look, pre-flood, clearly myth under my book. Clearly myth. Flood, like, there might have been a flood, but everything surrounding those events and even the characters, most likely myth. But once you get to Abraham, that's where it's hard to just be like, I mean, does legendary mean they didn't exist, or does legendary mean that they are embellished to the point of we cannot trust that what took place? You know what I mean? Because maybe, hold on.
Historical are considered to fall within the realm of mythology and legend, whereas everything after 931 is generally set within a
mythology. So maybe when he says legend, he doesn't mean that like definitively they didn't exist, but it's legend. It's more akin to a legend where there's potential for them to have existed, but we just don't have the right evidence to prove it. Which I guess maybe I'm jumping the gun to criticize how definitive his language is on that front.
Historical context. If you want to learn about the chronology that the Bible uses for the events that supposedly occurred before 931, I suggest you watch our video on biblical chronology, which I'll link to in the description. Okay, so like I said, this chart starts when there were two Israelite kingdoms, Israel and Judah. Now, like most societies, these two kingdoms had origin stories that had likely been passed down orally for many generations. And the interesting thing is that it seems like the ancient Israelites had two very distinct origin stories. One that centered on Moses and an arrival from Egypt, and one that centered on Abraham and an arrival from Mesopotamia. Now, obviously, these two origin stories were later combined into a single narrative, but originally, they were probably two different accounts of where the Israelites came from. So why did they have two accounts? Well, it's possible that one, probably the Moses one, was more popular in the north, and the other one, the Abraham one, was more popular in the south. Or it could have been more to do with different social classes. Either way, it probably relates to the fact that the ancient Israelites were originally a confederation of many tribes that eventually became more and more unified. Now, in addition to their origin stories, the Israelites also had some very old poetry and hymns that were passed down. One of these was the Song of Deborah, now found in Judges chapter 5. That particular part of scripture very likely represents the oldest verses in the entire Bible. However, when it comes to the oldest complete book of the Bible, that distinction probably belongs to Amos. Just prior to the destruction of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians, we get several prophets who wrote warnings to the people. So in addition to Amos, we also get Hosea and Micah, and most importantly, Isaiah. Although keep in mind that only the first 39 chapters of Isaiah were likely written by the original Isaiah, the rest being added much later. Also around this time, there were several books written that are now lost. For example, the Bible mentions a work called the Book of Jasher, as well as the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel and the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. There were also very likely stories about King David, either told orally or written down in books that are now missing. Sometime during the reign of King Josiah, all of these materials were used to create what is now known as the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. The team of authors who put together these books are usually referred to as the Deuteronomists, because they also put together the Book of Deuteronomy, which took the Moses story and combined it with a law code. So taken together, Deuteronomy plus Joshua through Kings represented the entire history of the Israelite people, from their arrival in Canaan to King Josiah. And it interpreted that history based on the law code given at the beginning, which focused primarily on the worship of only one God. Now, shortly after the reign of King Josiah, Judah ended up being conquered by the Babylonians, which led to its elites being exiled to Babylon. This is why the chart mentions a DTR1 and then a DTR2. These represent two different generations of Deuteronomist authors. So basically, after the destruction of Jerusalem, the Deuteronomists revised their earlier work in order to better explain why they had ended up in exile. However, during the Babylonian exile, we also get other schools of thought developing separate accounts of Israelite history as well. This might have been because there were different groups of religious scholars at the time, some of whom were the descendants of the Northerners and others who were from the South. So in addition to the work of the Deuteronomists, we also get a group working separately on the initial versions of Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers. This group used source material labeled J and E. If you're unfamiliar with
Oldest mention of the House of David. Still there. Interesting. And this oldest Bible verse is found. Yeah, if they commonly wrote it on scrolls, that's unfortunate. Seems like that is the case. Because should have taken a note out of the Egyptian book, because writing stuff down on where even the Babylonians and Sumerians, writing stuff down on clay lasts way longer than writing things down on scrolls. Scrolls deteriorate, they burn, they so many different ways to damage or destroy a scroll compared to clay or stone.
in order to better explain why they had ended up in exile. However, during the Babylonian exile, we also get other schools of thought, developing separate accounts of Israelite history as well.
So basically, my guess is oldest surviving text is around this time. Which one would think they would have the ability to write this stuff down beforehand. We just cannot come to the conclusion that they 100% did. Only that there's potential that they did in fact write it down. But yeah, once you've like settled, if you're constantly on the move, I mean, who's got time to like making sure you can write stuff down when you're on the move for sure, but it makes more sense once you're settled and you've designated certain places to keep the scrolls and everything like that. It does make more sense as to not bog yourself down. Okay, let's just keep going.
Of Deuteronomist authors. So basically, after the destruction of Jerusalem, the Deuteronomists revised their earlier work in order to better explain why they had ended up in exile. However,
only problem with these short videos is it's sort of like, it's like, can you show me how we know this? Gosh, I feel like I need to take like a gosh darn like college level class on the Torah.
During the Babylonian exile, we also get other schools of thought, developing separate accounts of Israelite history as well. This might have been because there were different groups of religious scholars at the time, some of whom were the descendants of the Northerners and others who were from the South. So in addition to the work of the Deuteronomists, we also get a group working separately on the initial versions of Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers. This group used source material labeled J and E. If you're unfamiliar with what that means and want to learn about it, check out the first episode in our Who Wrote the Bible series. Again, you'll find the link in the description. But for our purposes here, the important thing to note is that we now get the Moses origin story being combined with the Abraham origin story, and slightly different versions of the law code are being used. I should also point out that it was around this same time that Deutero-Isaiah was writing. Deutero-Isaiah likely being disciples from a school of thought that originated with the original Isaiah. They produced chapters 40 through 55 of Isaiah. We also get several other prophets, the most important being Jeremiah, who may have belonged to the...
Yeah, I'd love a video where they go and like show how they came to this conclusion. Because I was like, all right, sure. Why not?
Deuteronomist school, and who worked with a scribe named Baruch. Okay, so eventually the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, and the Persians allowed the Israelites, now called Jews, to return to their former kingdom, now called Judea. There, they rebuilt the temple and continued to develop more literature. Now, at this point, I should probably explain the color scheme used on this chart. The Hebrew Bible, which is known to Christians as the Old Testament, was originally divided into three main sections: the Torah, the Prophets, and the Writings. On this chart, blue represents the Torah, yellow represents the Prophets, and green represents the Writings. Let's look at the Torah first. During the Second Temple period, we get a group of priests known simply as P. They added a lot of new content to Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, and wrote the entire book of Leviticus, expanding on an earlier work known as the Holiness Code. These 4 books, which today are the first 4 in the Bible, are sometimes referred to as the Tetrarch. At some later point, a final redactor, known simply as R, combined the Tetrarch with Deuteronomy, added a few final things, and produced what is known today as the Pentateuch, or Torah. It is thought that Ezra may have been either one of the main P writers, or perhaps the final redactor. During the Persian period, we also get the book of Ezekiel written, as well as the final chapters of Isaiah and several other smaller prophetic books. However, we also get for the first time some of the books in the writings section getting close to their final forms, the 2 main ones being Psalms and Proverbs. Many of the Psalms were based on temple liturgies that go back to Israel's monarchy period, and many of the Proverbs are based on wisdom literature that also goes back to earlier times. The Persians, of course, were eventually replaced by the Greeks, and it was during the Greek period that the final books of the Hebrew Bible were written. These include Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, which were all probably written by the same team of authors and designed to be a new history of the Israelites, covering everything from creation to the construction of the Second Temple. We also get Esther and Daniel, Daniel being the last book to be written. However, the most important development to occur during the Greek period was the production of the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Torah, which during the subsequent Hasmonean period also came to include the rest of the Hebrew Bible as well. It was also during the Hasmonean period, when Judea enjoyed a brief period of independence, that most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were created and that most of the apocryphal books were written. Okay, so that takes care of the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament. We then get the arrival of Jesus on the scene, followed by the development of the New Testament. And the earliest books in the New Testament are actually not the Gospels, but the Pauline epistles. More specifically, the 7 Pauline epistles that are almost universally considered to be genuine. These include Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. We then get the Gospel of Mark, almost universally considered to be the earliest of the 4 Gospels. It was written right around the time that the Second Temple was destroyed, which was in 70 CE. Matthew and Luke almost certainly used Mark as a source, and then John was written last as a completely independent account. That was around 100 CE, which was also approximately when the rest of the Pauline epistles were written, as well as the general epistles and Revelation. All of these being written by anonymous writers, but usually claimed to be written by someone well known, like Paul, Peter, or John. Okay, from here, this chart shows some of the oldest manuscripts of the Bible that are still in existence. Of course, the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible are the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I mentioned earlier. But when it comes to the New Testament, the earliest manuscript we have is Papyrus 52, a tiny page from the Gospel of John that was likely created just a few decades after the original. We then get Papyri 46 and 66, representing the earliest complete books of the New Testament still in existence. Papyrus 46 being the oldest copy of the Pauline epistles, and Papyrus 66 being the oldest complete gospel. As for the oldest existing copy of the entire Bible, that would be Codex Vaticanus, written in Greek and dating to around 350 CE. It contains the Septuagint as well as all of the books from the New Testament. From this point forward, we also get some of the earliest manuscripts of the Bible in other languages as well, such as Coptic, Latin, Syriac, Ethiopic, and Gothic. Ironically, besides the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are incomplete, the oldest copy we have of the Old Testament in the original Hebrew comes from much later. That's the Masoretic text, which dates to around 1000 CE. Okay, so that was a very quick overview of when the various parts of the Bible were written. If you want to dive deeper into this topic, I again suggest you check out the links in the description to the various episodes from our Who Wrote the Bible series. And don't forget, if you want to buy a copy of this chart as a poster, you can head over to usefulcharts.com right now. Thanks for watching.
All right. Well, I think that's a fine note to close out on. What is going on here? Sorry, getting distracted. All right. Well, hope you all have a good day, and I'll be back here Thursday. Tomorrow is my day off from streaming, but I think we made some headway, and definitely some, good to just kind of dive into these different perspectives, some of which are thought-provoking, which I prefer. Gets the noggin going, and I'll, hopefully find out more as we go along. Get more good sort of perspectives on this. All right, y'all. Have a good one. Peace.